I came home a day early from a fishing trip only to find my wife of 40 years fighting for her life in the intensive care unit. But the real shock was not the flashing heart monitors or the frantic doctors rushing past me. It was my own son and his wife sitting in the waiting room, perfectly calm, swiping through luxury penthouses on an iPad as if waiting for a brunch table. Before I confront this ultimate betrayal, let me know which state or country you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you believe that greed is the quickest way to destroy a family. My name is Lawrence Hayes. I am 69 years old, a retired federal auditor, and this is the story of how I dismantled my own bloodline to protect the woman I love. It started on a crisp Friday morning. I was supposed to be halfway to Lake Michigan for a long weekend fishing trip with my old fraternity brothers. I had packed my truck, kissed my beautiful wife Evelyn goodbye, and hit the road before sunrise. Evelyn is 67, a retired public school teacher, and the absolute center of my universe. She had been dealing with some mild blood pressure issues lately, but nothing our doctors were overly concerned about. About 2 hours into the drive, a heavy, suffocating knot twisted in my stomach. It was not a physical pain, but a deep, primal intuition that something was terribly wrong. Call it the instinct of a man who has loved the same woman for 4 decades. I pulled over at an empty rest stop, tried calling her phone 3 consecutive times, and got sent straight to voicemail. Evelyn never ignored my calls. I turned the truck around immediately and sped back toward our home in the Chicago suburbs, breaking every speed limit on the interstate. When I unlocked the front door, the silence in our home was deafening. The house felt unnervingly cold. I called out her name, walking quickly through the hallway to the kitchen. That is when my heart dropped. Evelyn's daily pill organizer was lying cracked open on the hardwood floor. Dozens of her blood pressure pills were scattered across the expensive rug like tiny white stones. A heavy wooden chair was pushed back violently against the kitchen island, scraping the floorboards. I felt my chest tighten, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of my neck. I ran outside just as our neighbor, Mr. Henderson, was walking his dog down the sidewalk. He looked at me with wide, panicked eyes. "Lawrence," he called out, breathless. "Thank God you are here. The paramedics just left 20 minutes ago. They took Evelyn to the hospital. They had the sirens blaring." Panic is a natural human reaction, but panic makes you blind to the truth. For 30 years, I worked as a senior auditor for the federal government. My entire career was built on walking into chaotic, high-stakes environments and seeing the tiny, crucial details that everyone else missed. I hunted down white-collar criminals, traced hidden offshore accounts, and dismantled complex corporate frauds. My brain is hardwired to look for anomalies, to find the loose thread in a seemingly perfect tapestry. As I turned back into the house to grab my keys and our medical insurance cards, that auditor instinct kicked in and completely took over my fear. Something about the scene in the kitchen did not make sense. If Evelyn had simply collapsed from a sudden medical episode, why was her pill bottle forcefully thrown across the room, and why was the door to my home office, which I always kept locked when I traveled, standing wide open? I walked down the hall and stepped into the office. The heavy oak desk was undisturbed, but the large landscape painting on the wall was pushed aside. The wall safe, the one that held our most sensitive financial documents, the master copies of our wills and the deeds to our properties, was slightly ajar. I did not have time to check what was missing. My wife was fighting for her life, and that was the only thing that mattered in that terrifying moment. I slammed the safe shut, locked the house, and drove to Chicago General Hospital like a man possessed. The entire drive, my mind raced through endless calculations. The open safe and the scattered pills were 2 puzzle pieces that did not fit together. Evelyn did not open the safe. She hated dealing with the financial paperwork and deliberately left all the codes to me. So who was in my house? I gripped the steering wheel so hard, my knuckles turned white, praying to God that my wife was still alive. I promised the universe that if she survived this, I would hunt down and destroy whatever darkness had just entered our peaceful home. I sprinted through the hospital sliding doors, my heart hammering against my ribs. I bypassed the main reception desk and headed straight for the intensive care unit on the 3rd floor. When I burst through the double doors of the ICU waiting area, I expected to see my family in an absolute state of shambles. I expected tears, frantic pacing, and desperate prayers for a miracle. Instead, I found a scene that chilled my blood, warmer than any bitter winter wind. My son Aaron was sitting comfortably on a plush waiting room chair. He is 35 years old, A risk investment broker who always wore custom suits he could not really afford, constantly trying to project an image of massive wealth. Sitting next to him was his wife, Megan. Megan is 32, a white woman born into a wealthy family who treated everyone else like the help. She wore a designer trench coat and pristine makeup, looking completely undisturbed by the fact that her mother-in-law was on the brink of death. They were not holding hands for comfort. They were not looking anxiously at the ICU doors. They were huddled over a large iPad. I slowed my pace, my footsteps completely muffled by the thick hospital carpet. As I got closer, I could see the glowing screen clearly. They were on Zillow, not just looking at regular houses, but scrolling through a multi-million-dollar penthouse suite in downtown Chicago. Megan was pointing at the screen, her manicured finger tapping excitedly on a picture of a massive rooftop terrace. "This one has the exact square footage we need for the summer networking parties," she murmured, taking a casual sip from her iced coffee. Aaron nodded in agreement, swiping to the next photo of a luxury kitchen. "The homeowner association fees are a little steep, but once the new account's clear, it will not be an issue at all." I stood there in the quiet hallway less than 10 feet away, watching my only child and his wife casually shop for luxury real estate while the woman who gave birth to him was lying in a hospital bed attached to life support machines. The sheer audacity, the cold, sociopathic indifference of their behavior paralyzed me. I did not yell. I did not announce my presence and demand answers. The federal auditor in me took a step back into the shadows, letting the subjects reveal their true nature without interruption. I pressed my back against the cold hospital wall, remaining completely out of their line of sight. Megan leaned her head on Aaron's shoulder, letting out a soft, theatrical sigh that lacked any real human emotion. "How long did the doctor actually say?" she asked, her tone sounding more like a complaint about a delayed flight than a serious question about her mother-in-law's fading life. Aaron checked his expensive watch, a watch I knew he had bought using high-interest credit. He leaned in closer to his wife, lowering his voice to a dark, conspiratorial whisper. "The doctor just came out and said her organs are failing fast. She will not make it through the night." He paused, and a small, unmistakable smirk crossed his face. "Do not worry about the penthouse, babe. The family trust transfers tomorrow morning. Once she is gone, the old man will be so completely broken and confused that he will hand over everything just so we take care of him. We are finally getting what we deserve." My blood turned to absolute ice in my veins, my own flesh and blood. They were not waiting in this hospital for Evelyn to recover. They were excitedly waiting for her to die. Any normal father would have lost his mind right then and there. A normal man would have stormed across that brightly lit waiting room, grabbed his own son by the lapels of his custom-tailored suit, and demanded to know how he could be so exceptionally monstrous. I felt the urge, certainly. A hot, violent surge of adrenaline rushed to my fists, begging me to shatter the digital tablet they were using to plan their luxury future over my wife's hospital bed. I wanted to scream to alert the entire intensive care unit to the absolute evil sitting in their chairs. But rage is a sloppy weapon. Rage makes you loud, and loud men always reveal their hands too early. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the freezing, sterile air of the hospital corridor calm my racing heart and cool my boiling blood. I stepped backward, melting into the deep shadows of an alcove near a vending machine entirely out of their line of sight. My hands stopped shaking. The pure shock of the betrayal instantly hardened into absolute calculated clarity. If they wanted a war over my assets, I would give them a masterclass in financial annihilation. I reached into the inner pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out my encrypted smartphone. My thumb pressed against the biometric scanner and the screen illuminated my face. I bypassed the standard banking applications that regular consumers use and opened the direct access portal to my private wealth management firm. I stared at the screen, watching the cursor blink against the dark background. They believed Evelyn's impending death would automatically trigger the execution of the family trust, transferring the keys of our estate directly into their greedy hands. They thought the money was already theirs, merely waiting for a piece of paper signed by a doctor to unlock the vault. I selected the master directory of our family estate. It was time to cut off their oxygen supply before they even realized they were suffocating. For 30 years, I served as a senior auditor for the federal government. My job was not just looking at spreadsheets or balancing budgets. My job was hunting down hidden assets, freezing offshore accounts of white-collar criminals, and dismantling entire corporate fraud syndicates before the suspects even knew they were under federal investigation. I spent decades tracking dirty money through the most complex digital labyrinths in the world, tearing down arrogant men who thought they were untouchable. Setting up a bulletproof failsafe on my own personal wealth was absolute child's play. Aaron always assumed he was a full co-signer on our family accounts. He liked to brag to his friends and business associates that he managed his parents' portfolio, acting as if he were the mastermind behind our generational wealth. The reality was that he was merely an authorized user on a master trust that I controlled with absolute, unquestionable authority. Every supplementary card he carried in his expensive leather wallet, every platinum credit line Megan maxed out on designer clothes and spa treatments was tethered to a digital kill switch that only I possessed. I navigated to the Joint Trust tab on my screen. With a single tap of my thumb, I initiated an emergency lockdown protocol. A red banner flashed across the screen confirming the action. The trust was entirely frozen. No transfers in, no transfers out. I moved to the credit directory. I selected Aaron's supplementary platinum card, the exact one he used to finance his lavish dinners, and pretend he was a highly successful investment broker. I tapped the screen. Account suspended. Next, I pulled up Megan's 3 separate credit lines. I watched the status indicators change from active to revoked in real time. In less than 60 seconds, standing silently in a hospital alcove while my wife fought for her breath, I systematically dismantled their entire financial foundation. I erased their purchasing power, tanked their available credit, and severed their access to my wealth. They were now sitting in an expensive hospital dreaming of multi-million-dollar penthouses, completely unaware that they were absolutely flat broke. I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The trap was set. Now I just had to wait for the alarm to trigger. I did not have to wait long. Less than a minute later, the sharp, urgent buzz of a notification echoed from the waiting room. I peeked around the corner, watching them like a hawk. Megan was staring at her phone, her perfectly sculpted eyebrows pulling together in deep confusion. She tapped the screen aggressively, her manicured nail clicking sharply against the glass. "Aaron," she muttered, her voice tight with sudden, uncharacteristic irritation. "My transaction just failed." Aaron did not even look up from the real estate application on the tablet. "Just run it again, babe. It is probably a network error on their end. You know how these banking apps get on weekends?" Megan shook her head, her face flushing with mounting anger. "I just did. It says declined. The deposit for the penthouse reservation was rejected. American Express just sent me a critical fraud alert stating the account is entirely restricted." Aaron finally looked up, his expression shifting from arrogant boredom to genuine confusion. "That is impossible. I just checked the available balances yesterday. We had plenty of clearance. Let me use my card to clear the hold." He pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and opened his banking application. I watched his thumbs fly across the screen trying to log into the portal. Suddenly his hands stopped moving. The color drained from his face at a terrifying speed. He blinked rapidly, staring at his screen as if it were written in a foreign language. "Access denied," he whispered, his voice trembling with a sudden raw panic. "It says my login credentials have been revoked and the master account is under administrative lockdown." Megan grabbed his arm, her designer facade cracking completely to reveal the panicked, greedy opportunist underneath. "What do you mean revoked, Aaron? Call the concierge desk right now. Fix this before we lose the penthouse." Aaron dialed the bank frantically, holding the phone to his ear, his leg bouncing up and down in pure anxiety. The arrogant heir who was just celebrating his mother's impending death was now sweating through his custom suit, realizing the golden goose had just been slaughtered. Aaron lowered his phone slowly from his ear, his hand visibly shaking against the side of his face. The bank representative had clearly just delivered the devastating news that his financial privileges were permanently terminated by the primary account holder and that no overrides would be permitted. Megan stared at him, her eyes wide with mounting terror, demanding to know what was happening and why the bank refused to cooperate. Aaron swallowed hard, his throat bobbing as he struggled to find his voice. He turned his head, his panicked gaze frantically scanning the empty hospital corridor, desperately searching for an answer to his sudden financial ruin. His eyes swept past the nurse's station, past the bright vending machines, and finally landed directly on me. I stepped completely out of the shadows, allowing the harsh fluorescent lights to illuminate my face. Aaron's skin went entirely pale, devoid of all color, looking as though the blood had been drained from his veins. I walked slowly toward them, my footsteps deliberate and heavy against the floor. I stopped right in front of his chair, looking down at his terrified face, and stated coldly, "Cards are locked, son." Aaron sprang to his feet, attempting to use his height and his custom-tailored suit to intimidate me. The sheer audacity of his pivot from a panicked thief to an outraged, grieving son was almost impressive. "Dad, what is wrong with you?" he demanded, his voice echoing slightly in the quiet intensive care unit waiting area. My mother is lying in a hospital bed fighting for every breath, and you are playing financial games. Unlock the accounts right now. We need that money to pay for her medical bills. We need to secure the best specialists, the best surgeons, and upgrade her to a private recovery suite immediately. We cannot wait for standard hospital administration." Megan instantly flanked him, nodding vigorously and adopting a look of profound manufactured distress. She even managed to produce a single theatrical tear. "Lawrence, how could you be so cruel at a time like this? We are just trying to make sure Evelyn gets the absolute best care possible to save her life," she added, her voice dripping with artificial empathy. I did not blink. I did not raise my voice or react to their performance. I looked at the two of them with the cold, detached gaze of an auditor inspecting a fraudulent tax return. "You do not need a single dime for her medical bills," I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. "I spent 30 years working for the federal government. My premium retirement health insurance package covers 100% of all medical expenses, including intensive care, top-tier specialists, and any private suite she might ever require. The hospital already has my policy on file. There are no out-of-pocket costs. None." Aaron's jaw tightened, the muscles ticking as his excuse evaporated into thin air. His eyes darted nervously around the room, realizing his justification for needing immediate access to the trust was completely destroyed. The narrative of the devoted son trying to save his mother had been dismantled in less than 30 seconds. He had no counter-argument, only the naked reality of his own greed exposed under the harsh hospital lights. Before Aaron could formulate another pathetic lie to justify his desperation for cash, the heavy double doors of the intensive care unit swung open. Dr. Eris Thorne, the lead attending physician overseeing Evelyn's case, stepped into the waiting area. He wore a crisp white coat, but his posture was rigid, and his expression carried a dark, heavy weight that immediately caught my attention. He noticed the hostile tension radiating between my son and me instantly. Dr. Thorne glanced at Aaron and Megan, his eyes lingering on them for a brief, calculating second before he turned his attention entirely to me. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I need to speak with you regarding your wife's condition privately." He gestured toward a secluded corridor leading to the staff consultation rooms, far away from the prying ears of my son and his wife. I gave Aaron one final piercing look, a silent promise that our conversation regarding his frozen assets was far from over, before I turned and followed the doctor. During my decades working federal fraud cases, I learned to read the unspoken language of professionals who were about to deliver devastating information. You look at their hands, their eye contact, the rigid set of their shoulders. Dr. Thorne was not acting like a physician preparing to deliver a standard speech about a failing heart or natural organ failure. He was acting like a whistleblower about to hand over a highly classified, incredibly dangerous dossier. He guided me into a small, windowless office and firmly shut the door behind us, ensuring the latch clicked securely into place. He did not ask me to sit down. Instead, he pulled a printed medical document from a secure folder he had tucked under his arm. "Mr. Hayes, I ordered a comprehensive expedited blood panel and toxicology screen the moment your wife was admitted." Dr. Thorne began, his tone strictly clinical but laced with a deep, unsettling concern. Given her age and her history of mild hypertension, the initial paramedics assumed she suffered a severe natural cardiovascular event. However, the physical presentation at the time of admission did not align with a standard stroke or a natural heart attack. I took the document from his hands, feeling the gravity of the moment settle over the room. The numbers and chemical markers printed on the page were complex, but my analytical mind immediately recognized the stark, bolded red text indicating severe, life-threatening abnormalities. I scanned the data, my eyes locking onto the specific toxicology breakdown. I am not a medical professional, but the highlighted metrics regarding her prescribed hypertension medication were impossible to misinterpret. Dr. Thorne pointed directly to the most critical line on the report. Evelyn was not experiencing a natural medical crisis. He stated, his voice steady but grim. Her system is completely overwhelmed by a massive toxicity level of her prescribed beta blockers. The concentration of the medication in her bloodstream is catastrophic. She was given at least 4 times her maximum daily prescribed dose. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest, but my mind instantly began assembling the facts with terrifying clarity. Evelyn was notoriously meticulous about her medication. She had a daily pill organizer categorized by the days of the week, and she never missed a dose, nor did she ever double up. She was a retired schoolteacher who lived her life by strict routines and precise schedules. The image of her pill organizer lying cracked open on our kitchen floor, the pills violently scattered across the expensive rug, flashed vividly in my mind. The open home safe in my office, the sudden inexplicable drop in her health. It was not a tragic accident. It was a calculated lethal overdose. The massive influx of the drug had caused her blood pressure to plummet to fatal levels, starving her brain and major organs of oxygen, perfectly mimicking a massive natural stroke. Everything was designed to look like an unfortunate tragedy of old age. I stared at the paper, processing the sheer malice required to execute such a plan. Someone had walked into my home, bypassed the security system, and deliberately poisoned the woman I loved to trigger an early inheritance. They had counted on my grief to blind me to the details. They had counted on the doctors writing it off as a common senior citizen health failure. Dr. Thorne took a step closer to me, lowering his voice so much that it was barely a whisper. He looked me directly in the eyes, completely breaking the standard clinical detachment of a physician. He knew exactly what this toxicology report implied, and he knew that the authorities would inevitably have to be involved. Evelyn did not accidentally ingest a fatal dose of her medication. Mr. Hayes, the doctor whispered, his tone filled with absolute certainty and a chilling dread. The capsules found partially dissolved in her digestive tract were of a completely different, highly concentrated synthetic brand. We are preserving the stomach contents as physical evidence. You need to be extremely careful about who you trust right now. Someone intentionally swapped her pills, Mr. Hayes. I thanked Dr. Thorne and asked him to secure the physical evidence in the hospital lockbox. I did not walk back into the waiting room to confront the murderers who shared my last name. Instead, I pulled out my phone and dialed the local police precinct. I requested officers be dispatched to the intensive care unit, immediately, citing an attempted homicide by poisoning. 10 minutes later, 2 uniformed officers walked through the double doors. I met them in the corridor, handed them a printed copy of the toxicology report, and explained exactly what the lead physician had just uncovered. As we approached the waiting area, Aaron and Megan saw the badges. For a split second, sheer panic washed over Aaron's face. But Megan was faster. The moment the officers asked for their identification, Megan unleashed a theatrical performance that belonged on a silver screen. She collapsed into Aaron's chest, letting out a loud, agonizing sob that echoed through the quiet ward. "Officer, thank God you are here," she cried, her voice trembling with manufactured hysteria. "We have been so terrified. My father-in-law is not in his right mind. He has been suffering from severe cognitive decline for the past year. He forgets where he is, he locks us out of accounts, out of sheer paranoia, and now he is making up wild conspiracies." She wiped a fake tear from her cheek, staring at the officers with wide, innocent eyes. "Lawrence has been managing Evelyn's medication," she continued, her voice breaking perfectly. "He refuses to let us hire a home nurse. He is so confused and delusional. He must have accidentally mixed up her prescription bottles this morning. He gave her the wrong dose, and now he is trying to blame us to cover up his own terrible mistake." She buried her face in her hands, weeping loudly. Aaron immediately wrapped his arm around her, playing the role of the protective, grieving husband comforting his traumatized wife. He looked at the officers with a practiced expression of deep sorrow and pity. "It is true, officers," Aaron said softly. "My father's dementia is escalating rapidly. We love him deeply, but he is becoming incredibly dangerous to my mother and himself." The officers exchanged a hesitant glance. I stood there watching this grotesque manipulation unfold with absolute clarity. During my 30 years as a federal auditor, I sat across from cartel financiers, corrupt politicians, and corporate embezzlers. I know exactly how guilty people act when cornered. They deflect, they project, and they aggressively attack the credibility of the witness. I addressed the officers calmly, stating my professional background and presenting my federal credentials. I explained that my wife was a victim of a targeted poisoning to accelerate the execution of our family trust. However, my analytical mind already saw the fatal flaw in my immediate position. The police operate on hard, undeniable evidence to make an on-site arrest. While the toxicology report proved that a crime had been committed, it did not prove who committed it. The officers asked if I had interior security cameras in our kitchen or hallway to verify who physically touched the pill organizer. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I had always valued our privacy and strictly refused to install cameras inside the main living areas of our home. Without video evidence proving Aaron or Megan physically swapped the capsules, the police were legally paralyzed. It was a domestic dispute layered over a medical emergency. The older officer sighed and handed my credentials back. Mr. Hayes, we will open a formal investigation and assign a detective to look into the toxicology report, he explained politely but firmly. But right now, we cannot place anyone in handcuffs based solely on accusations and a medical anomaly. We need a warrant and we need physical proof tying them to the tampering. Until then, this remains a civil and medical matter. The officers took our statements and eventually exited the ward, leaving the three of us alone once more. The moment the heavy doors swung shut behind the police, the fake tears vanished from Megan's face instantly. She straightened her designer coat and smirked. Aaron stepped forward, emboldened by the police departure. He realized that the lack of immediate legal consequence gave him a terrifying window of opportunity. He was no longer just trying to defend himself, he was going on the offensive. Aaron squared his shoulders and walked directly up to me, invading my personal space. The facade of the morning sun was completely gone, replaced by a cold, calculating predator who recognized a legal loophole he could exploit. You really thought you could just lock my accounts and call the cops to take us away in handcuffs? He sneered, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. You are slipping, old man. You used to be so sharp when you were auditing the government, but now you are just a sad, desperate relic making wild accusations in a hospital hallway. The police are not going to save you. They think you are a confused senior citizen who poisoned his own wife by accident, and frankly, that is exactly what the rest of the world is going to believe. I maintained my ground, refusing to let his intimidation tactics break my composure. You will not get away with this, I stated evenly. The detectives will pull the security logs from your neighborhood. They will check the pharmacy records for the synthetic beta blockers. I will drag you through federal court until you are locked in a concrete cell for the rest of your natural life. Aaron let out a sharp, arrogant laugh that bounced off the sterile walls. By the time any detective gets around to looking at pharmacy records, this will all be over, he said. Megan stepped up beside him, crossing her arms with a look of absolute triumph. You played your hand too early, Lawrence, she mocked. You gave us the perfect narrative. The crazy old man who locks his family out of their finances, hallucinates murder plots, and accidentally poisons his wife. We are going to use that exact story to take everything from you. Aaron leaned in closer, his dark eyes locking onto mine with an absolute chilling malice. You are a danger to yourself and a danger to my mother, he whispered maliciously, ensuring every word carried the weight of a death sentence. You have proven that you cannot be trusted to manage your own life, let alone our family estate. I am not waiting for you to make another mistake. First thing tomorrow morning, my lawyers are filing an emergency petition in probate court. I am filing for full legal guardianship over you. I am going to have a judge declare you mentally incompetent. I am putting you in a locked memory care facility, and I am taking over complete control of Mom's medical decisions. I did not waste another second breathing the same recycled hospital air as my son. If Aaron planned to file emergency guardianship papers by morning, the clock was already ticking relentlessly against me. I had less than 12 hours to secure my physical documents, back up my digital drives, and prepare a counteroffensive that would withstand the intense scrutiny of a probate judge. I turned my back on his arrogant threats and walked straight out of the intensive care unit, my shoes hitting the linoleum floor with heavy, determined thuds. I drove back to my house in complete silence, the dark suburban streets offering no comfort. When I unlocked the front door, the emptiness of the rooms hit me harder this time. Evelyn should have been sitting in her floral armchair reading her mystery novels and complaining about the cold draft. Instead, the house felt like an active, contaminated crime scene. I bypassed the kitchen and went directly to my home office. I needed the master trust binders and the original medical directives. Aaron had managed to pry the wall safe ajar during his earlier invasion, but he had clearly been in a frantic rush. Sensitive papers, tax returns, and old property deeds were strewn across the Persian rug. As I knelt to gather our most vital documents, a crumpled piece of heavy wax-lined cardstock stuffed near the very bottom of my wastebasket caught my attention. Aaron had used my private office to sift through his own terrifying mess, carelessly discarding what he thought a grieving, distracted old man would never look twice at. I reached in and pulled out the crumpled parcel. It was a heavily taped international courier envelope, violently torn open and shoved out of sight. I emptied the contents onto my desk. Inside was a thick stack of printed ledger screenshots and high-resolution surveillance photographs. The photos were not of luxury penthouses or expensive cars. They were incredibly invasive surveillance pictures of Aaron walking to his vehicle in a dimly lit parking garage. Aaron sitting at a high-end restaurant completely unaware he was being photographed through a window. Aaron standing outside his own front door, the crosshairs of a camera lens visible in the watermark. Accompanying the disturbing photos was a printed financial statement showing a catastrophic negative balance of $250,000. The document was stamped with a crimson hourglass logo I recognized instantly from my days at the bureau. My son was not just a greedy opportunist waiting for an inheritance to fund a lavish lifestyle. He was a desperate, terrified man backed into a lethal corner. During my 3 decades as a federal auditor, I did not just audit domestic tax returns or review standard corporate compliance. I spent 15 highly classified years attached to a joint task force tracking cartel finances and dark web money laundering operations across the globe. I know precisely how invisible money moves, and I know exactly the kind of people who move it. The crimson hourglass logo on that discarded ledger belonged to a ruthless, illicit cryptocurrency syndicate operating out of Eastern Europe. They provided massive, uncollateralized leverage to arrogant finance brokers who thought they could outsmart the digital market. When those brokers inevitably lost the money, the syndicate did not send polite collection letters or hire legal debt collectors. They sent physical, violent threats. I immediately booted up my air-gapped, secure administrative terminal, a custom encrypted setup I kept strictly isolated from our main home network. Aaron had logged into our wireless router earlier that day when he broke into my office to crack the safe, and that was his ultimate fatal mistake. He left a brilliantly clear digital footprint. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I pulled the router logs, isolated his media access control address, and traced the hidden internet protocol destinations he had been desperately pinging for the last 48 hours. The raw data packets told a horrifying story of absolute financial ruin. Aaron had been hemorrhaging money for months, losing massive margins on synthetic crypto derivatives that he did not fully understand. He had liquidated his own savings, maxed out his credit lines, and borrowed $250,000 from men who would eagerly break his legs or put him in the ground. He was completely underwater. The lavish lifestyle, the custom-tailored suits, the arrogant posturing with Megan in the hospital waiting room, it was all a desperate, paper-thin facade meant to project success. He was drowning, and his creditors had finally given him an ultimate deadline. That explained the terrifying urgency. That explained why he could not simply wait for a natural inheritance years down the line. He needed massive liquidity instantly to save his own life, and the only way to acquire it was to murder his mother and forcefully incapacitate his father. He was treating our family estate like a salvage yard to pay off an Eastern European crime ring. I navigated through the encrypted transaction ledgers, pulling the exact wallet addresses he had been interacting with. The sheer volume of his losses was staggering, but what truly caught my eye was a specific outgoing command protocol repeatedly bouncing against my own secondary banking portal. He had not just been looking at the terrifying scope of his debts. He had been actively trying to bridge a massive payment using our assets. I immediately pivoted from the network logs and logged directly into my secure banking interface. I bypassed the standard consumer dashboard and accessed the back-end pending transaction queue, an area Aaron did not realize I monitored. There, sitting quietly in the international processing folder, was an automated wire transfer scheduled to clear the exact moment the European banking windows opened. The requested amount was exactly $250,000. Aaron had set the routing destination to a series of masked offshore shell accounts linked directly to the syndicate wallets I had just identified. I pulled up the digital authorization slip attached to the wire. My stomach churned with a sickening blend of absolute disgust and profound rage. The signature on the electronic authorization scan was Evelyn's. Aaron had carefully and deliberately forged his dying mother's signature, timing the transfer perfectly, so that the cash would vanish overseas before any probate court or guardianship hearing could ever freeze her specific individual accounts. He used her forged signature to bypass the joint security measures we had in place, banking on the cowardly assumption that I would be too emotionally destroyed by her presence in the intensive care unit to check the secondary banking ledgers. He was essentially using her stolen life to buy back his own pathetic existence. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I highlighted the entire transaction block and triggered a hard administrative kill switch. I revoked the routing authorization, flagged the transfer as critical international fraud, and locked the originating account entirely out of the global SWIFT network. The pending status icon flashed from a cautionary yellow to a bright definitive red. Terminated. The money was not going anywhere. I permanently severed his lifeline to the syndicate, effectively sealing his fate with the ruthless criminals he had so foolishly borrowed from. I disconnected my terminal, wiped the active session cache, and started packing my critical trust documents into a secure, fireproof briefcase. I needed to get back to the hospital and establish a physical perimeter around Evelyn before the morning sun rose. Just as I secured the heavy brass locks on the briefcase, a sharp, piercing chime broke the heavy silence of my home office. It was not my primary smartphone. It was the untraceable burner phone I kept hidden in my bottom desk drawer strictly for emergency two-factor authentication intercepts. The screen illuminated the dark room, displaying a plain text message routed through a highly encrypted proxy service. The syndicate had clearly detected the catastrophic failure of the wire transfer, and they had bypassed Aaron's compromised phone to message the primary account holder directly. I picked up the cold device and read the glowing text. "Your son owes us $250,000. If the wire does not clear by midnight, we visit the ICU." The glowing text message on my burner phone was a digital declaration of war. Midnight was approaching fast. I shoved the encrypted device into my coat pocket, grabbed the heavy fireproof briefcase containing my master trust documents, and sprinted to my truck. The drive back to Chicago General Hospital was a blur of adrenaline and calculated strategy. I was fully prepared to face down Eastern European debt collectors in the hospital lobby to protect my wife. I spent the entire night sitting rigidly in the stiff plastic chair outside the intensive care unit, watching every shadow and scrutinizing every person who stepped off the elevators. The syndicate never showed up. Cowards rarely execute their threats when they know the target is actively waiting for them. But as the sun began to rise, painting the hospital corridors in a harsh, unforgiving light, a completely different, much more insidious threat arrived. The heavy elevator chimes echoed through the silent ward at 7 in the morning. The metallic doors slid open and Megan stepped out. She was not alone. Flanking her were her parents Richard and Victoria Graham. The Grahams were the absolute epitome of inherited corporate arrogance. Richard wore a bespoke navy suit that cost more than a standard mortgage payment, and Victoria carried herself with the icy, untouchable posture of a woman who had never been told no in her entire life. They did not rush toward the intensive care unit to ask about Evelyn or check her vital signs. They did not offer a single word of sympathy or condolence regarding the woman who was supposedly their extended family. Instead, they marched down the corridor like a conquering army, completely ignoring the solemnity of a medical facility. Behind them walked 3 men in immaculate gray suits carrying thick leather briefcases, corporate litigators, the kind of high hourly rate mercenaries wealthy families use to crush opposition through sheer financial attrition. Aaron trailed slightly behind the legal team, looking visibly relieved, having hidden himself securely beneath the protective, wealthy umbrella of his white in-laws. Richard Graham stopped a few feet away from me, looking down his nose with an expression of profound, unfiltered disdain. He did not see a retired federal auditor or a grieving husband fighting for his family. He looked at me the way he probably looked at a mismanaged corporate asset. Lawrence Richard stated, his voice booming with unearned authority. "This ridiculous charade ends right now. You are going to unlock my daughter's accounts, and you are going to step aside so the adults can handle this situation." I stood up slowly, planting my feet firmly on the linoleum, and adjusted my jacket. I spent 30 years of my life dismantling corrupt corporate executives who looked, talked, and acted exactly like Richard Graham. I knew their playbook intimately. They weaponize their wealth, manipulate the legal system, and rely on the sheer intimidation of their social status to bulldoze anyone standing in their way. Richard was furious that his daughter was financially inconvenienced, completely disregarding the terrifying fact that she and her husband were actively conspiring to murder my wife for a payout. The lead attorney stepped forward, purposefully cutting off any verbal response I was about to give. He unclasped his heavy briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of freshly stamped legal documents. "Mr. Hayes," the lawyer said, in a sharp, mechanical tone designed to intimidate, "I am serving you with a temporary restraining order signed at 4 in the morning by a municipal judge. You are legally required to maintain a distance of 500 feet from Aaron Hayes, Megan Graham, and this specific intensive care unit." I took the paperwork and scanned the front page of the court order. Megan had utilized the exact narrative she test drove with the police the night before, expanding it into a full legal assault. The affidavit painted a horrifying, completely fabricated picture. She claimed I was a hostile, confused, and abusive old black man suffering from severe, undiagnosed dementia. She stated under oath that my aggressive financial lockdown was an act of domestic terror and that I was medically endangering my wife due to my severe paranoid delusions. The Grahams had undoubtedly called in a massive favor from a country club judge to bypass the standard procedural waiting periods. They used their immense privilege to fast-track a legal weapon designed to physically remove me from the premises before I could mount a defense. They wanted me out of the building so Aaron could proceed with his emergency guardianship hearing unopposed later that morning. They were using the law as a blunt instrument to execute a hostile takeover of my family, my accumulated wealth, and my wife's critical medical care. It was a calculated assassination of my character built entirely on racial and generational stereotypes funded by their seemingly endless bank accounts. I knew that arguing with a piece of paper in a hospital hallway was a losing battle against these types of enemies. Before I could dissect the legal absurdities of the document any further, the hospital administration intervened. The Grahams had not just brought the paperwork to me, they had already presented a certified copy of the restraining order to the hospital director to ensure my immediate removal. 2 large security guards accompanied by the night shift administrator approached our tense standoff. The administrator looked deeply uncomfortable but visibly intimidated by the aggressive posturing of the corporate legal team. "Mr. Hayes," the administrator said apologetically, avoiding my direct gaze and glancing nervously at the high-priced lawyers. "We have been presented with a binding court order. I am incredibly sorry about your wife's condition, but for the safety and liability of this hospital, I have to ask you to vacate the premises immediately. If you refuse, we are legally obligated to call the police and have you arrested for violating the restraining order." I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated fury threatening to break my composure. I wanted to reach into my pocket and hand the administrator my burner phone. I wanted to show them the text message from the crypto syndicate proving that real violent criminals were actively threatening this exact hospital ward and that my presence was the only thing preventing a catastrophe. But the seasoned auditor inside my brain calculated the variables instantly. If I shouted about Eastern European hitmen and digital death threats, the lawyers would immediately point to my outburst as absolute proof of my documented paranoid delusions. If I fought the security guards, I would be handcuffed, thrown into a police cruiser, and locked in a holding cell. Being in jail would leave Evelyn completely defenseless against Aaron's forged medical proxies. I had to maintain my freedom to fight them in a court of law. I smoothed the lapels of my jacket, picked up my fireproof briefcase, and nodded sharply to the security guards. "I will walk out on my own," I stated firmly, staring directly through Richard Graham. The 2 massive security guards escorted me down the long, sterile corridor toward the main elevators. Every step felt like a brutal, tactical retreat in a war I had absolutely no intention of losing. I memorized the names of the corporate lawyers printed on the document headers and cataloged the exact security personnel who enforced the eviction. I pressed the call button and the heavy metal doors slid open with a soft, echoing chime. I stepped inside the elevator cabin and turned around to face the intensive care unit waiting area one last time. Through the wide glass partition, I saw the Grahams celebrating their swift legal victory, shaking hands with their expensive attorneys. Then Aaron stepped out from behind his wealthy in-laws. He was completely insulated, funded by their money, and protected by their lawyers. He looked directly at me through the glass, a sickeningly arrogant smirk spreading across his face. He raised his hand and gave me a slow, mocking wave goodbye just as the elevator doors slid completely shut. The heavy elevator doors closed on my son's mocking face, sealing me out of the intensive care unit, where my wife lay fighting for her life. I did not waste time slamming my fists against the metal or shouting at the security guards who escorted me to the hospital lobby. Every second I spent displaying anger was a second the Graham family and their corporate lawyers used to tighten the legal noose around my neck. I walked out of the sliding glass doors into the biting morning air, climbed into my truck, and immediately drove downtown. I needed a weapon that could match their high-priced litigation team. I needed Jonathan Ellis. Jonathan is 50 years old, a former federal prosecutor who transitioned into private practice specializing in complex financial law and aggressive elder rights litigation. We had worked together during my auditing days dismantling corrupt corporate structures, and he possessed the exact type of cold, ruthless intellect required for this fight. His office was a minimalist fortress of glass and steel overlooking the Chicago skyline. When I walked into his private conference room, Jonathan was already standing by the window reviewing a digital tablet with a deep scowl. He did not offer a polite greeting. He knew the situation was far past the point of pleasantries. "Lawrence," he began, his voice sharp and direct. "I just pulled the emergency filings from the county probate court. The Grahams did not just secure a temporary restraining order to get you out of the hospital building. Aaron filed a supplementary petition 30 minutes ago, and it is a nightmare." He placed the tablet on the long mahogany table, sliding it toward me. I looked down at the digital document, my eyes scanning the heavily redacted legal jargon. Aaron had submitted a newly minted, aggressively notarized medical proxy. This document officially named him as the sole individual authorized to make life or death medical decisions for Evelyn, completely overriding my spousal rights by citing the restraining order and my supposed mental instability. "It gets worse," Jonathan stated grimly, bracing both hands on the table. "Aaron leveraged the toxicology report you handed to the police. He spun the narrative. He is claiming your severe dementia caused you to accidentally overdose your own wife, leaving her in a vegetative state with zero chance of recovery. Using this forged proxy, Aaron has officially instructed the hospital administration to terminate Evelyn's life support tomorrow at exactly noon." The words struck me with the force of a freight train. Noon tomorrow. They were not just trying to secure an inheritance or cover up their financial crimes. Aaron was orchestrating the legalized execution of his own mother to stop her from ever waking up and exposing the poisoning. He was utilizing the hospital protocol to finish the job the synthetic beta blockers had started. If he pulled that plug, the trust would automatically transfer. The syndicate would get their $250,000, and I would be left to face a fabricated manslaughter charge while mourning the only woman I ever loved. "That document is a complete fabrication," I stated, my voice dropping to a low, absolute register. Evelyn never signed a medical proxy handing Aaron that kind of authority. She would never have permitted it. I needed Jonathan to understand the depth of this forgery. Evelyn was a retired public school teacher, a woman who operated on strict principles and razor-sharp intuition. She loved our son, but she was never blind to his flaws. 10 years ago, when Aaron first started trying to project the image of a hotshot investment broker, Evelyn saw right through his custom suits and expensive watches. She recognized the reckless, impulsive nature that drove his decisions. When we sat down with our estate planners to draft our master wills and medical directives, she was adamant. She explicitly named me as her sole medical proxy. In the event I was incapacitated or deceased, she named her younger sister in Atlanta as the secondary proxy. Aaron was purposefully and entirely excluded from the chain of command. Evelyn had stated perfectly clearly that Aaron lacked the moral spine to handle a life or death decision, predicting he would always choose the easiest, most self-serving route. She had been tragically, terrifyingly right. Jonathan nodded, tapping his pen against the polished wood of the table. "If we can prove this new proxy is a forgery, we can file an emergency injunction to halt the life support termination and have Aaron arrested for perjury and falsifying legal documents. The probate judge will demand physical proof. A handwriting expert can invalidate Aaron's document within hours, but the court will absolutely require the original notarized master directive to prove the chronological impossibility of his claim." "Where is the original master copy kept?" "It is locked inside my biometric wall safe in my home office," I replied, already calculating the logistics of retrieving it. "I have the physical documents, the original ink signatures, and the notary seals." "There is a massive operational problem," Lawrence Jonathan warned, pulling up another document on his tablet. "When you called the police to the hospital and reported the poisoning, they opened a preliminary investigation into the tampering of the pill organizer. Because Megan convinced them you were the primary suspect, and because the pills were ingested at your residence, the local police department has officially declared your house an active crime scene. They dispatched a forensics unit an hour ago. They have sealed the property with police tape pending a full search warrant. If you go near that house, you violate the perimeter of an active investigation. If a patrol car spots you, you will be arrested for tampering with a crime scene, and you will be sitting in a holding cell tomorrow at noon when Aaron unplugs Evelyn's ventilator." I looked Jonathan dead in the eye. "I am not letting my wife die because of a piece of yellow plastic tape. Prepare the emergency injunction. Have the judge standing by. I will get you the original documents." I left his office and drove back to the sprawling suburban neighborhood I had called home for 2 decades. The mid-morning sun illuminated the manicured lawns and quiet driveways. I parked my truck 2 streets over, hiding it behind a tall row of thick hedges near the community park. I could not risk a passing patrol car running my license plates. I approached my own property from the rear, navigating through the wooded boundary that separated our backyard from the nature trail. Moving with the silent precision I had honed during my years shadowing cartel operations for the federal government, I slipped through the tree line and observed the perimeter. Jonathan was right. Bright yellow police tape was stretched tightly across my back patio, sliding doors, and the front porch entrance. A single patrol car sat idling at the end of the cul-de-sac, the officer inside seemingly busy looking at a computer terminal. I was a 69-year-old man sneaking into a house I bought and paid for with 30 years of honest work, treated like a criminal while the real murderers wore designer coats in the hospital lobby. I crouched low, using the large oak tree in the backyard to block the line of sight from the street. I approached the basement bulkhead doors. They were ancient, heavy steel doors that Evelyn always complained about. The police had taped the main entrances but completely ignored the rusted padlock on the storm cellar. I retrieved a hidden spare key from inside a fake sprinkler head, unlocked the heavy padlock, and slipped silently into the dark, damp basement. The house above me was completely silent. I navigated the familiar wooden stairs, avoiding the third and fifth steps that I knew would creak violently. I moved like a ghost through my own kitchen, ignoring the chalk outlines the forensic team had drawn around Evelyn's scattered pills on the floor. I walked straight down the hallway and entered my home office. The room was cast in heavy shadows, the blinds tightly drawn. I approached the large landscape painting on the wall and pushed it aside to reveal the heavy steel face of the biometric wall safe. I pressed my thumb against the scanner. A small green light blinked approvingly. I inputted my secondary digital passcode, listening to the satisfying heavy click of the internal locking mechanism disengaging. I grabbed the heavy steel handle and pulled the safe door wide open, reaching inside to grab the thick manila envelopes that held our estate plans, our passports, and our emergency funds. My hand hit nothing but cold, bare metal. I froze my breath, catching sharply in my throat. I pulled a small flashlight from my pocket and illuminated the dark interior of the vault. The safe was entirely empty. The thick envelopes were missing. The master will, the original medical proxy, and the emergency bearer bonds had been stripped completely bare. The real proxy was gone. The cold, bare metal of the empty safe stared back at me like a hollow eye. I stood entirely frozen in the dim light of my home office, processing the catastrophic reality of what this meant. The original notarized medical proxy was gone. The master will was gone. The emergency bearer bonds were gone. Without those physical documents, Jonathan and I had absolutely zero ammunition to bring to the emergency probate hearing. The legal system operates entirely on verifiable proof, not on the desperate, passionate claims of an aggrieved husband. I glanced at the heavy analog clock sitting on my mahogany desk. I had precisely 12 hours left before Aaron would walk into the hospital administration office with his forged proxy and legally execute his own mother. 12 hours before they pulled the ventilator plug, starving Evelyn of oxygen and triggering the automatic, irrevocable transfer of our entire estate. My mind raced through the terrifying implications. I was currently standing in the middle of a police-barricaded crime scene, risking immediate arrest for tampering, and the one weapon I needed to save my wife's life had been stolen right out from under me. Panic is a completely useless emotion, but the sheer weight of the ticking clock threatened to crush my practiced composure. If I walked into that courtroom empty-handed, the judge would look at the police report review, Megan's fabricated restraining order, and officially declare me a delusional, abusive senior citizen. Aaron would win. The Eastern European crypto syndicate would get their $250,000 funded entirely by the blood of the woman I loved. The safe showed absolutely no signs of forced entry. The biometric scanner was physically intact, and the reinforced steel hinges were perfectly aligned. Whoever emptied the vault did not use a heavy crowbar or a blowtorch. They used my personal, highly classified digital passcode. The violation of my sanctuary felt absolute. They had bypassed every physical defense I had built to protect my family. I had exactly 12 hours left to pull a miracle out of thin air. During my extensive career auditing massive corporate fraud rings, I learned a fundamental truth about modern criminals. They always leave a digital shadow. No matter how meticulously a thief wipes their fingerprints from a physical surface, they inevitably forget the invisible eyes that surround our daily lives. I forced my breathing to slow, intentionally pushing the horrifying image of Evelyn in the hospital bed out of my immediate thoughts. I needed to think exactly like an investigator standing in a hostile environment. I systematically scanned the perimeter of my office, letting my eyes trace the crown molding the edges of the heavy desk and the tall bookshelves. My gaze locked onto the top shelf of the towering mahogany bookcase positioned directly opposite the open safe. Tucked discreetly behind a row of thick tax code encyclopedias and a sprawling potted fern was a tiny, unassuming black cylinder. 6 months ago, Evelyn had been complaining over breakfast that she kept missing the vibrant cardinals and blue jays that visited the bird feeder right outside my office window. She was a woman who found immense quiet joy in the smallest details of nature. To bring a smile to her face while I was working, I ordered a cheap battery-operated pet camera online for $30. It was a simple piece of plastic that blended perfectly into the shadows of the dark wood. It did not have a glowing recording light, nor did it emit any sound when activated. It was designed to watch animals without startling them, making it the perfect hidden observer. I mounted it on the top of the bookcase, angling its wide lens perfectly toward the window. Because the biometric safe is mounted directly adjacent to that specific window, the camera's field of view inadvertently captures the entire left wall of my office. I never integrated this cheap device into our primary home security system because it was nothing more than a novelty item. It ran on its own isolated prepaid cellular connection and uploaded motion-triggered video clips directly to a basic offshore cloud server. It was entirely invisible to anyone scanning the main household network. I pulled my untraceable burner phone from my jacket pocket, my thumb hovering over the screen. I navigated through the generic application folders and opened the camera software I had downloaded months ago. My hands were remarkably steady, driven by pure cold adrenaline. The application loaded smoothly, presenting a chronological list of archived motion events. I quickly filtered the cloud storage logs by date and time, scrolling back to the exact chronological window when Aaron and Megan were inside the house before I arrived from my canceled fishing trip. A specific video thumbnail caught my eye, time-stamped just 30 minutes before the paramedics were dispatched to treat Evelyn's overdose. I tapped the file. The high-definition video feed buffered for a fraction of a second before playing with crystal-clear clarity on my screen. I fully expected to see Aaron breaking into the room, sweating and frantic to steal the money he owed the syndicate. Instead, the figure stepping confidently into the frame was Megan. She was wearing the exact same designer trench coat I saw her wearing later in the intensive care unit waiting room. She moved with the entitlement of a woman who believed the world owed her everything. She did not look panicked or rushed. She approached the large landscape painting covering the vault, pushed it aside with practiced, arrogant ease, and stared directly at the digital keypad of my safe. She did not hesitate for even a second. She did not attempt to guess the combination. She typed my 12-digit secondary alphanumeric passcode without missing a single keystroke. The heavy steel door swung open smoothly. Megan reached inside, grabbing the thick manila envelopes containing our entire estate plans, the emergency bearer bonds, and the original medical proxy. She shoved the irreplaceable documents unceremoniously into her expensive leather handbag. The sheer precision of her movements proved this was not an opportunistic crime of passion. This was a highly premeditated, surgically executed theft. She possessed my most guarded security code. She knew exactly what documents to take and precisely where they were located, operating with the cold efficiency of a professional thief. Watching her invade my private space, casually stealing the documents that dictated my wife's medical fate, filled me with a quiet, lethal rage. This was the same woman who had weaponized her tears to the police, playing the victim, while her hands were literally stained with the theft of our future. The high-definition video footage was utterly devastating, providing the undeniable physical proof I needed to destroy their forged proxy in court. But the cheap pet camera also featured a built-in, highly sensitive directional microphone. As Megan adjusted the straps of her designer bag, checking to ensure the thick envelopes were completely hidden from view, she let out a sharp, arrogant exhale. The audio feed was perfectly clear in the otherwise silent office. She looked down at the digital keypad of the open safe, smirking to herself with a twisted sense of accomplishment. I turned the volume on my phone up to the maximum setting. The microphone captured her muttering with cold, sociopathic satisfaction. "Good thing I installed that keylogger on the old man's laptop," she whispered to herself. The audio recording of my daughter-in-law confessing to felony cybercrimes echoed in my mind as I slipped quietly out of my home. I bypassed the police perimeter completely undetected, securing the digital evidence that would dismantle their entire legal strategy. By 10:45 in the morning, I was standing outside the heavy oak doors of courtroom 4B at the Cook County Probate Court. Jonathan Ellis was waiting for me. His tailored suit immaculate, his expression a mask of pure, lethal professionalism. I handed him the burner phone and explained exactly what the hidden pet camera had captured. Jonathan did not smile. He simply nodded, his eyes sharpening into the cold gaze of a former federal prosecutor preparing for a public execution. At exactly 11 o'clock, we pushed the courtroom doors open. The emergency hearing was already in session. The environment was thick with expensive cologne and manufactured grief. Aaron and Megan were seated at the petitioner's table, dabbing their eyes with tissues, playing the roles of the traumatized loving children perfectly. Sitting directly behind them in the gallery were Richard and Victoria Graham, radiating an aura of untouchable corporate arrogance. The lead attorney for the Grahams was standing before the judge, waving the forged medical proxy like a flag of victory. "Your Honor," the lawyer stated in a smooth, practiced baritone designed to manipulate. "We are asking the court to grant immediate authorization for my client Aaron Hayes to execute his mother's final medical directives. The medical reality is tragically clear. Evelyn Hayes has suffered irreversible brain damage due to a catastrophic medication error committed by her husband, Lawrence Hayes. Mr. Hayes is suffering from severe documented cognitive decline and has become a physical danger to his wife. We must respectfully ask the court to allow my client to terminate life support today at noon, as dictated by this legally binding proxy, to end her suffering peacefully." The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking. They were weaponizing the judicial system to finalize an attempted murder. I glanced at the large clock on the mahogany-paneled wall. It was 11:10. We had exactly 50 minutes before the hospital administration would accept the court's ruling and pull the ventilator plug on the woman I loved. 50 minutes to stop a legalized assassination. Jonathan and I walked straight down the center aisle, our footsteps echoing loudly against the polished marble floor, completely ignoring the outraged murmurs from the Grahams' legal team. During my 30 years dismantling corporate fraud rings and international money laundering operations, I learned a vital truth about confronting professional liars. You never argue with a liar because arguing validates their premise. You do not debate a forgery. You destroy the person holding the pen. Jonathan did not offer an opening statement or address the opposing counsel with procedural pleasantries. He approached the clerk's desk, plugged a small digital receiver into the courtroom's primary multimedia presentation system, and synchronized my burner phone. "Your Honor." Jonathan said, his voice cutting through the thick courtroom tension like a sharpened scalpel. "Opposing counsel has presented a medical proxy they claim was retrieved securely from my client's home safe. We have no intention of debating the authenticity of that document verbally today. We would rather the court witness exactly how that document was obtained." Jonathan tapped the screen of his tablet. The massive digital monitor mounted directly above the jury box flickered to life. The high-definition footage from the hidden pet camera began playing in crisp, undeniable clarity. The entire courtroom watched as Megan Graham, wearing the exact same designer trench coat she currently had draped over her chair, casually pushed aside the landscape painting in my home office. She punched in my 12-digit biometric bypass code with practiced ease, cracked the heavy steel vault, and emptied the sensitive contents into her luxury handbag. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, stifling, and heavy with impending doom. Then the sensitive directional microphone picked up her smug self-satisfied whisper. "Good thing I installed that keylogger on the old man's laptop." The color instantly drained from Megan's face. She looked like a ghost, her mouth hanging slightly open in pure, unfiltered terror. Richard Graham gripped the wooden railing of the gallery partition, his knuckles turning white as he realized his daughter had just been broadcast committing multiple federal felonies on the public record. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense magistrate with a reputation for merciless efficiency, slammed his wooden gavel down with a sharp, explosive crack. The sound shattered the stunned silence of the room. He glared at the petitioner's table with a look of absolute disgust. Counsel, the judge, barked at the Grahams' lead attorney, who was now sweating profusely and frantically packing his leather briefcase. "The medical proxy submitted to this court is hereby revoked, effective immediately. Furthermore, I am issuing a direct order to the district attorney's office to open an immediate criminal investigation into Megan Graham for felony theft, breaking and entering, and violations of the Federal Computer Fraud and Abuse Act." Bailiffs secure the petitioner. Panic erupted at the defense table. Megan began to hyperventilate desperately, grabbing her father's arm over the wooden railing, begging him to fix it. But Richard Graham physically pulled away, his corporate survival instincts overriding his parental loyalty. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. Aaron, realizing his entire financial salvation and legal cover had just evaporated in a matter of seconds, completely snapped. The polished, arrogant facade of the wealthy investment broker disintegrated instantly. His massive debt to the Eastern European crypto syndicate was looming over his head, and I had just destroyed his only escape route. "You ruined everything," Aaron roared, his voice cracking with a terrifying, unhinged desperation. He vaulted over the heavy wooden table, kicking chairs out of his way, and lunged directly at me with his fists raised. I did not flinch. I did not even take a single step back. Before he could close the distance, two massive courtroom bailiffs tackled him violently to the marble floor. They pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, driving their knees into his spine as they clamped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. The loud clack of the metal restraints echoing in the room signaled the end of his arrogant reign. He writhed against the floor, but the bailiffs held him down with absolute authority. The bailiffs hauled Aaron roughly to his feet, treating him with the exact level of disrespect a cornered criminal deserves. His custom-tailored suit was torn, his silk tie twisted sharply around his neck. Megan was screaming hysterically as additional officers moved in to detain her as well. The courtroom was in absolute chaos, the judge shouting for order over the immense commotion. As the bailiffs dragged Aaron backward down the center aisle toward the holding cells, he fought against their grip and locked his crazed, desperate eyes on mine. His face was twisted into a malicious, deeply disturbed smile that sent a spike of pure dread straight through my chest. "You think you won?" Aaron screamed, his voice echoing violently through the heavy oak doors. I signed the transfer papers at 6 a.m. Mom is already gone. The echo of Aaron screaming those words bounced off the marble walls of the courthouse. I did not stay to watch the bailiffs drag him into the holding cells. I turned on my heel and bolted out of the heavy oak doors, leaving Jonathan to handle the legal fallout with the judge. My chest tightened with a suffocating dread. I pushed my truck engine to its absolute limit, weaving through the dense Chicago traffic, running 2 red lights to get back to Chicago General Hospital. I abandoned the truck in the emergency drop-off zone and sprinted through the sliding glass doors, ignoring the protests of the security guards. I reached the 3rd-floor intensive care unit and pushed past the nurse's station, heading straight for the room where I had left my wife fighting for her life. I stepped into the room and the air physically left my lungs. The bed was completely empty. The heart monitors were turned off, the intravenous stands were pushed into the corner, and the freshly changed bedsheets were perfectly smooth. Evelyn was gone. I cornered the floor charge nurse, demanding to know where my wife had been taken. The nurse looked at me with a mix of pity and administrative defensiveness. She explained that at 6 o'clock that morning, Aaron arrived with a fully notarized medical proxy and a private transport team. Because the court had not yet revoked the document at that early hour, the hospital administration was legally bound to comply. Aaron signed an emergency transfer order against medical advice, citing a sudden need for specialized palliative care. He exploited a massive bureaucratic loophole, moving her out of the secure hospital environment before the judge could strip his power away. The hospital staff had no legal grounds to stop a man holding a valid medical directive from moving his own mother. I demanded to know the destination. The nurse shook her head, stating Aaron had explicitly invoked aggressive privacy protocols under the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, locking me out of the system entirely. I did not waste a single second arguing with a hospital employee bound by strict federal privacy regulations. Arguing with front desk staff is what helpless people do. I turned my back on the nurse's station, walked straight out to the hospital parking garage, and climbed into the cab of my truck. During my 15 years working joint task forces tracking cartel money laundering, I frequently collaborated with the Office of Inspector General at the Department of Health and Human Services. We hunted down massive medical billing frauds, phantom clinics, and corrupt private ambulance networks. I still had direct numbers to federal analysts who owed me their careers. I pulled out my encrypted burner phone and dialed a private unlisted Washington number. It rang twice before my old contact answered. I did not exchange pleasantries. I told him I needed an immediate backdoor trace on a private medical transport that left Chicago General Hospital at exactly 6 in the morning. Private ambulance companies operate on incredibly tight profit margins. To ensure they get paid by federal or private insurance, they log their dispatch codes, vehicle telemetry, and patient destination records into the centralized billing clearinghouses the second their wheels start turning. My contact did not ask for a warrant. He owed me his life after I pulled his unit out of a compromised sting operation a decade ago. He tapped into the back end of the Medicare billing registry, bypassing all civilian privacy blocks, and pulled the active transport manifest for Evelyn's name. Within 4 minutes, he had the exact name of the private transport company and the active global positioning system ping from the ambulance dispatch transponder. I grabbed a pen from my glove compartment and scribbled the coordinates on the back of a parking receipt. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and fired up my truck's navigation system. I expected the destination to be a rival medical facility across state lines, maybe a private hospital in Indiana or Wisconsin, where Aaron thought he could buy enough time to finish his lethal plan. But when the route populated on my dashboard screen, the chilling reality of their strategy became horrifyingly clear. The red navigation line did not point toward another major metropolitan hospital or a recognized trauma center. The coordinates led me away from the main interstate highways, routing my truck deep into the heavily wooded, isolated outskirts of the northern suburbs. I drove past the dense commercial zones, entering a secluded area dominated by high privacy fences and towering pine trees. The further I drove from the city, the more my blood boiled with a dark, terrifying realization. No legitimate critical care patient is ever transferred to a location lacking immediate access to emergency surgical facilities. The road narrowed into a private, unmarked asphalt driveway heavily obscured by thick vegetation. The digital pin on my tracking software indicated the ambulance had stopped moving exactly 22 minutes ago at the end of this concealed path. I pulled my truck onto the shoulder of the road, killing the engine and the headlights a half-mile away to avoid alerting anyone to my approach. I stepped out into the freezing air, relying on my decades of tactical experience to approach the property unseen. I moved quietly through the tree line until the structure came into view. It was a sprawling, heavily fortified estate converted to look like a high-end residential property surrounded by tall, wrought-iron gates and modern security cameras. There were no hospital signs, no red crosses, and no emergency loading zones. It was completely dark and entirely silent. It looked like a black site designed for people who were never meant to be found. I pulled my encrypted phone out and ran a rapid public records search on the exact address using the county property tax database. The results loaded instantly, and the final piece of this sinister puzzle clicked into place. The property was not a registered medical facility or a licensed hospital. It was a completely unlicensed, highly secluded private hospice center masquerading as a residential estate. I scrolled down to the corporate ownership section of the property deed. It was registered to a shell company known as Apex Holdings. I cross-referenced the corporate officers for Apex Holdings and stared at the names printed on the glowing screen. The facility was entirely owned and operated by Richard and Victoria Graham. They brought her here to finish the job quietly. I stepped away from the dark tree line and pulled my encrypted burner phone from my jacket. I did not dial the standard emergency dispatch. That would trigger local protocols, slow responses, and bureaucratic hurdles that the Graham family lawyers could easily intercept and stall. Instead, I called the personal cell phone of the county sheriff, Marcus Vance. Marcus and I had crossed paths a decade ago during a massive tri-state federal task force operation. I had effectively saved his career by keeping his department out of the crossfire of a corrupt federal indictment, and he owed me a debt he swore he would repay. I gave him the exact coordinates of the compound and told him a kidnapping disguised as a medical transfer had just occurred involving my wife. Within 15 minutes, 3 marked police cruisers rolled silently up the darkened private driveway, their red and blue lights painting the tall, imposing wrought iron gates in harsh, strobing colors. I stepped out of the shadows and met Marcus at the front perimeter. We buzzed the heavy brass intercom. A few agonizing minutes later, the facility director marched down the long driveway. He was a tall, excessively groomed man wearing a tailored charcoal suit that screamed corporate cronyism rather than genuine medical care. He stood safely behind the locked iron gate, looking at the sheriff and me with a bored, deeply condescending smirk. "Gentlemen, this is a highly secure private palliative care estate," the director stated smoothly, his voice dripping with practiced arrogance. "We do not admit visitors outside of approved daytime hours, and we certainly do not open our doors to local law enforcement without a signed judicial warrant." Marcus stepped forward, resting his hand on his utility belt, demanding immediate access to conduct a wellness check on Evelyn Hayes. The director shook his head, pulling a folded document from his breast pocket and waving it through the bars. Evelyn Hayes was transferred to this facility legally by her son, Aaron Hayes, who holds a fully executed and notarized medical proxy. He has strictly forbidden any outside contact, specifically naming Lawrence Hayes as a hostile and dangerous threat to the patient's well-being. You have absolutely no jurisdiction here without a superior court order overriding that proxy. The director smiled, a smug, untouchable grin spreading across his face. He thought he had the ultimate legal shield. He thought he was dealing with an ordinary, desperate husband who would merely yell and scream against an iron gate until the police forced him to leave. He was completely wrong. I did not waste a single breath arguing about probate law, medical proxies, or temporary restraining orders. I reached into my heavy fireproof briefcase and pulled out a thick, tightly bound dossier I had compiled on my encrypted drive months ago. During my years as a senior federal auditor, I made it a strict professional habit to run deep background checks on anyone closely associated with my family. When Aaron married Megan, I investigated the Graham family wealth. I discovered they owned dozens of shell companies, and this facility, operating under the corporate umbrella of Apex Holdings, was their most lucrative and dirtiest cash cow. I shoved the heavy dossier forcefully through the cold iron bars of the gate, hitting the director squarely in the chest and forcing him to take it. "I am not here to debate family court procedures or medical directives," I said, my voice echoing like a death knell in the freezing quiet night. "I am a retired federal auditor. You are holding a 10-year forensic breakdown of this specific facility's operational finances. You have been actively billing Medicare for ghost patients, systematically overcharging the government for specialized life support equipment that does not even exist on this property, and funneling the massive profits through offshore shell accounts in the Cayman Islands to avoid federal taxes." The director opened the folder with a scoff, but the smug smile instantly vanished from his face, replaced by a chalky, terrified pallor. He stared wide-eyed at the printed spreadsheets, the highlighted routing numbers, and the undeniable categorized proof of his direct complicity in a multi-million-dollar federal fraud ring. "If you do not open this gate right now," I continued, stepping closer so he could see the absolute lethal promise in my eyes, "I will send this entire file directly to the Office of the Inspector General. The Federal Bureau of Investigation will raid this compound before the sun comes up. They will freeze your personal bank accounts, seize your properties, and you will spend the next 20 years in a federal penitentiary for defrauding the United States government." I checked my watch, tapping the glass face with my index finger. "You have exactly 10 seconds to decide if dying in a concrete cell is worth protecting Richard Graham's real estate empire." The director swallowed hard, a bead of sweat rolling down his temple despite the freezing temperature. His loyalty to the Grahams was bought with money, and I had just promised to take all of his money away and destroy his freedom. He turned around with trembling hands and typed an override code into the security keypad. The heavy iron gates unlocked with a loud mechanical clank and swung open. We did not wait for a polite invitation to enter. Marcus and his deputies marched aggressively through the front glass doors, immediately securing the main lobby while I sprinted down the primary corridor. The interior of the building was a horrifying, deceptive facade. It looked exactly like a luxury 5-star hotel, complete with classical artwork, dim lighting, and plush carpets, but it entirely lacked the sterile, urgent, and life-saving energy of a legitimate medical facility. It was nothing more than a glorified, expensive waiting room for death. I checked the room numbers rapidly and kicked open the heavy door to Suite 4. Evelyn was lying in a large mechanical hospital bed in the center of the dark room. Her skin was terribly pale, and she was hooked up to a rudimentary intravenous drip that looked completely unregulated and highly suspicious. The heart monitor beside her bed beeped at a terrifyingly slow, sluggish pace. I rushed to her side, grabbing her cold hand in mine. She was entirely unresponsive, kept in a medically induced heavy haze by the facility staff to ensure she could not fight back, wake up, or call out for help. "Get a federal transport unit here right now," I shouted over my shoulder to Marcus, my voice sharp and commanding. "Do not use the local county dispatch. Call the Veterans Affairs Hospital and get a secure, federally protected medical transport vehicle. Nobody touches my wife unless they have high-level federal clearance." Marcus nodded and relayed the urgent order through his shoulder radio. The local deputies locked down the room, physically removing the facility's private staff and ordering them to stand against the hallway walls with their hands visible. I stood guard over my wife, watching the open doorway like a hawk, trusting absolutely no one in that cursed, corrupt building. Within 20 agonizing minutes, a heavy-duty transport vehicle from the federal hospital arrived with sirens blaring. Highly trained paramedics rushed into the room, ignoring the facility staff, and expertly transferred Evelyn from the hospice bed to a secure mobile stretcher. They swapped out the shady intravenous lines for heavily monitored, legitimate medical equipment, stabilizing her vitals with professional precision and speed. We flanked the stretcher tightly as the paramedics rapidly wheeled Evelyn down the lavish, deceptive hallway and out into the freezing night air. The flashing red and blue lights of the ambulance cut sharply through the darkness, signaling our successful escape from the Grahams' black site. I kept my hand resting gently on Evelyn's shoulder as they began to load her into the back of the transport vehicle. Suddenly, a young private nurse in a plain blue uniform rushed out of the facility doors. She looked absolutely terrified, her eyes darting nervously toward the facility director, who was currently being aggressively questioned by a deputy near the front gate. She bumped into me intentionally, making it look like a clumsy accident to anyone watching, and shoved a small, folded piece of paper directly into my palm. She immediately backed away, lowered her head, and vanished back into the shadows of the building. I opened my hand and unfolded the crumpled note. Under the harsh, flashing glow of the ambulance lights, the handwritten words sent a spike of pure, terrifying ice straight through my heart. Your daughter-in-law paid me $5,000 to inject her with potassium tonight. The crumpled note in my hand was a physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated evil. Potassium administered intravenously in a massive, unregulated dose stops the heart instantly and is notoriously difficult to detect during a standard medical autopsy. Megan had not just planned a generalized demise for my wife by altering her prescribed pills. She had orchestrated a targeted, untraceable medical execution to ensure Evelyn never woke up to testify against them. I secured the terrifying note in my breast pocket, climbing into the back of the federal transport vehicle as the heavy doors slammed shut, sealing Evelyn safely inside. My wife was finally out of their reach, secured under intense federal protection where no forged proxy or paid assassin could ever touch her. But Aaron and Megan were still breathing free air. Following their spectacular and humiliating meltdown in probate court, their high-priced corporate lawyers had managed to post an exorbitant bail, springing them from the county holding cells before the sun even set. They were temporarily free from local law enforcement, but they were utterly trapped in a much deadlier cage. By freezing the family trust and halting that initial wire transfer, I had pushed Aaron past the crypto syndicate deadline. The Eastern European enforcers do not care about probate court delays, frozen trust funds, or high-priced attorneys. They operate strictly on violence and absolute deadlines. Aaron and Megan were entirely out of cash, stripped of their legal cover and bleeding out in the open water with apex predators circling. I knew their immense desperation would force them to make a catastrophic mistake. When cornered, arrogant predators always abandon caution and lunge for the closest piece of bait. I was going to provide that bait. After ensuring Evelyn was safely admitted to the secure federal facility and placed under round-the-clock armed guard, I drove back to my dark, silent house. The local police had lifted the crime scene tape after validating my security footage, leaving my home office exactly as Megan had ransacked it hours prior. I sat down at my heavy oak desk and stared directly at my primary laptop. Megan actually thought she was a master hacker because she managed to purchase a commercially available keylogger and install it on my machine to steal my passwords. During my years running complex cyber audits for the federal government, I designed intricate honeypot networks specifically engineered to trap international hackers attempting to breach Treasury databases. I knew exactly how to weaponize her own amateur surveillance tool against her. I did not remove the malicious software. I embraced it. I booted up the compromised laptop, allowing the hidden keylogger to actively record my every keystroke. I intentionally navigated to a highly secure offshore banking portal located in the Cayman Islands. It was a dummy account I had established years ago during an undercover auditing operation, entirely disconnected from my actual family wealth, but looking incredibly authentic and robust on the surface. I typed in a complex, newly generated password slowly and deliberately, ensuring the spyware captured every single alphanumeric character. Once inside the portal, I manipulated the front-end source code of the banking interface to display a massive, highly visible liquid balance of exactly $500,000. It was a digital mirage, a brilliant pile of fool's gold sitting completely exposed on the screen. To make the trap absolutely irresistible, I left the session active, intentionally disabling the two-factor authentication protocols and removing the automated timeout features. I was leaving the digital vault door wide open, unguarded, and overflowing with cash. I knew Aaron and Megan were sitting in some dark room, terrified out of their minds, frantically monitoring the keylogger data feed for any sign of financial salvation. I was handing them the exact amount of money they needed to pay off the syndicate and fund their escape, wrapped in a shiny, easily accessible package. All they had to do was reach out and steal it. With the bait fully deployed on the compromised laptop, I pivoted to my secure air-gapped terminal to set the snare. I engineered a sophisticated digital tripwire directly into the routing architecture of the offshore account. If anyone attempted to move those funds, the system would not block the transaction. Instead, it would allow the digital handshake to capture the destination routing numbers, log the exact internet protocol addresses of the perpetrators, and instantly flag the movement across state and international lines. I sat back in my leather chair, the glow of the monitors casting long shadows across my office walls. The waiting game was a familiar, grueling exercise I had endured many times during federal stakeouts. I poured myself a single glass of black coffee and kept my eyes locked fiercely on the network traffic logs. As the night deepened, the tension in the room grew suffocating. The analog clock on my desk ticked relentlessly toward midnight, the exact deadline the crypto syndicate had issued in their terrifying text message earlier that week. I visualized Aaron pacing the floor of whatever luxury apartment his wealthy in-laws were hiding him in, sweating profusely as the minutes bled away. I pictured Megan furiously typing on her own device, validating the stolen credentials I had just spoon-fed her. They were entirely out of options, out of time, and completely out of their depth. At 11:45, the network log on my secure terminal registered a sudden, massive spike in external activity. Someone was utilizing the stolen credentials to establish a secure handshake with the Cayman Islands server. The digital intruders bypassed the primary landing page and navigated straight to the transfer directory. They were moving blindly and aggressively, driven by pure, unadulterated survival instinct. I leaned forward, my heart hammering a steady, relentless rhythm against my ribs as the clock finally struck midnight. The dark screen of my secondary terminal suddenly flashed a brilliant, blinding crimson red. The automated alert sirens chimed sharply in the quiet office. They took the bait. The system confirmed an unauthorized outbound transfer of $500,000 initiated from an external residential network and routed across multiple state lines toward an untraceable crypto wallet. By executing that single keystroke using stolen digital credentials to move fictitious capital across federal borders, Aaron and Megan had just bypassed simple theft and instantly committed textbook federal wire fraud. The trap had snapped completely shut, and they had just handed me the key to their prison cell. The blinding crimson alert on my secure terminal had barely faded when my encrypted burner phone buzzed violently against the heavy oak desk. The digital trap I had carefully engineered had triggered a catastrophic chain reaction much faster than I initially anticipated. The fake offshore funds they attempted to steal naturally failed to clear the syndicate's internal verification protocols, leaving Aaron and Megan entirely exposed to the wrath of Eastern European enforcers. They were completely cornered by violent criminals on one side and the looming shadow of federal investigators on the other. I fully expected them to retreat and fortify their legal defenses behind Richard Graham's massive corporate legal team. Instead, the message glowing on my device was a direct, desperate plea from a rat preparing to abandon a rapidly sinking ship. Megan sent a secure text demanding a clandestine meeting at a dilapidated 24-hour diner on the industrial outskirts of the city, explicitly stating she was coming alone. I recognized the classic self-serving maneuver immediately. When a parasitic organism realizes its host is dying, it detaches and frantically searches for a new lifeline to drain. Megan knew Aaron was a dead man walking, and she was brutally calculating her own exit strategy without him. I secured my physical documents in the fireproof safe, locked my home office, and drove my truck through the freezing pre-dawn mist toward the industrial district. The diner was a greasy, neon-lit relic, completely devoid of the luxury and prestige the Graham family demanded in their daily lives. It was the absolute last place anyone would expect to find the pampered heiress to a real estate empire. I parked my truck in the darkest corner of the cracked asphalt lot and walked inside. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed loudly overhead, illuminating the cheap vinyl booths and the sticky linoleum floors. I spotted her immediately in the furthest corner booth, keeping her back to the large front windows to avoid being seen from the street. I slid into the booth opposite her, maintaining the cold, detached posture of a federal auditor sitting across from a confessed embezzler. I did not order coffee. I did not offer a polite greeting. I simply stared at her, waiting for the inevitable betrayal to spill from her mouth. The woman sitting across from me was entirely unrecognizable from the arrogant, impeccably groomed socialite who had mocked me in the intensive care unit just 48 hours prior. Megan was violently shivering, her hands wrapped tightly around a chipped porcelain coffee mug as if it were her only source of warmth. Her expensive designer trench coat was heavily wrinkled, and her face was stripped of its flawless makeup, revealing dark, terrified bags under her eyes. She looked exactly like a cornered fugitive. During my years investigating corporate fraud, I learned that people born into inherited wealth possess an incredibly fragile, brittle kind of arrogance. They project absolute invincibility when shielded by their parents' money, but the moment they face real physical consequences, they completely shatter into a million pieces. Megan was thoroughly shattered. She leaned across the sticky table, her eyes darting nervously toward the diner's entrance. "Lawrence, I am not going down for this," she whispered, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "The people Aaron owes money to are actively threatening us. Aaron is completely out of his mind. He ruined everything. I have the physical proof you need to put him away forever, but I am not giving it to you for free." She reached into her coat pocket with trembling fingers and placed her smartphone on the table, sliding it exactly halfway between us. She tapped the screen, opening a hidden encrypted audio file. The recording was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. It was the sound of a blender whirring in my own kitchen. Then Aaron's voice cut through the noise, frustrated and rushed. "I am crushing the beta blockers directly into her morning smoothie. It is the only way to ensure she ingests the massive dose without tasting the synthetic capsules. Make sure the container is washed before the old man gets back from his fishing trip." I felt a surge of pure lethal fury tighten my chest. This was the definitive, undeniable proof of the physical poisoning. Megan had recorded her own husband committing attempted murder, functioning as her ultimate insurance policy. She had always planned to sell him out the second his financial schemes failed. I kept my expression entirely blank, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing my internal burning rage. I stared at the digital audio file glowing on her screen, instantly recognizing the immense legal power of that single recording. It was the exact piece of evidence the district attorney needed to elevate the charges from circumstantial medical negligence to premeditated first-degree attempted murder. "You recorded your own husband poisoning his mother just to use it as leverage," I stated, my tone dropping to a chilling, absolute monotone. Megan did not flinch or attempt to defend her morality. She simply nodded, her survival instinct overriding any lingering sense of marital loyalty or basic human decency. "I am a realist, Lawrence," she replied coldly, her shivering momentarily stopping. "Aaron is a sinking ship, and I absolutely refuse to drown with him. I will transfer the original unedited audio file directly to your secure server right now. It is everything you need to lock your son in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. In exchange, you are going to wire $100,000 into a secure, untraceable account I have set up in Zurich. I need that cash to disappear to Europe before those crypto enforcers find me and before the federal agents execute their arrest warrants." The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. She was attempting to extort the very man she had conspired to rob and murder. I looked at her shivering, desperate form and slowly pulled my smartphone from my jacket. I opened my banking application, navigated to a liquid discretionary account, and inputted her international routing numbers. I typed in the exact amount of $100,000 and authorized the immediate transfer. I held up my phone, showing her the bright green confirmation screen. The funds were instantly deployed, vanishing into her designated European account. Megan let out a massive, shuddering breath of profound relief. The terrified, shivering fugitive vanished entirely, and a sharp flicker of her old, arrogant smirk returned to her face. She swiftly transferred the audio file to my device, grabbed her designer bag, and stood up from the torn vinyl booth. She truly believed she had just outsmarted a retired federal investigator and secured her freedom. "You always were way too sentimental, Lawrence," she mocked softly, turning her back on me and walking out of the dingy diner into the freezing morning air. I sat perfectly still, watching her figure disappear through the glass windows. I did not panic about the wired funds. I calmly reached inside the inner breast pocket of my heavy jacket and pulled out a high-grade, continuous digital voice recorder. I pressed the stop button, saving the crystal-clear audio track. I had just recorded her committing felony extortion. I secured the digital voice recorder inside the inner pocket of my heavy jacket, feeling the cold, hard plastic against my chest. I had just acquired the ultimate, undeniable proof of my son's attempted murder and my daughter-in-law's felony extortion. I walked out of the diner parking lot, leaving Megan to her foolish illusions of escape, and drove my truck straight back to the secure federal medical facility. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the Chicago skyline, casting a harsh, unforgiving light across the frosted windshield. I felt a grim sense of absolute triumph. I had the entire conspiracy locked down. I had the financial wire fraud, the forged medical proxies, the recorded confessions, and the illegal transfer logs. All I had to do was walk into Evelyn's recovery room, hold her hand, and wait for the federal agents to sweep up the human garbage that had infiltrated our family. I flashed my federal credentials at the heavily armed security perimeter and bypassed the standard visitor checkpoints, making my way directly to the secure intensive care wing. But the moment the heavy elevator doors slid open on her floor, my entire world completely shattered. The quiet, sterile calm of the medical ward was gone. A piercing, high-pitched klaxon wailed through the corridors, the sound cutting into my brain like a physical blade. Bright red strobe lights flashed violently above the nurses' station. Medical staff were sprinting down the hallway, shouting urgent, overlapping commands, pushing crash carts loaded with emergency defibrillators and heavy oxygen tanks. I froze for a fraction of a second, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as I registered the room number they were rushing toward. It was Suite 4, Evelyn's room. A harsh mechanical voice echoed over the overhead public address system, declaring a code blue. The sound of a flatlining heart monitor, a continuous, unbroken, terrifying tone spilled out from the open doorway. Her heart had completely stopped. I sprinted down the corridor, dropping my heavy fireproof briefcase onto the linoleum floor, completely abandoning the documents and evidence I had fought so hard to secure. None of it mattered. 2 federal security guards intercepted me at the threshold of the suite, planting their hands firmly against my chest and physically driving me back into the hallway. I did not fight them. I stood entirely paralyzed behind the thick glass partition, watching the chaotic, desperate battle unfolding around my wife's hospital bed. A team of 6 doctors and nurses swarmed her frail body. One nurse was aggressively performing deep chest compressions, the rhythmic, brutal force threatening to crack her ribs, while the lead physician ripped her hospital gown open to attach the defibrillator pads. "Clear," the doctor shouted, his voice muffled through the heavy glass. He pressed the paddles to her chest. Evelyn's body arched violently off the mattress, a brutal, unnatural convulsion driven by thousands of volts of electricity. The monitor remained a flat, deadly line. My breathing became ragged and shallow. For 30 years, I operated in a world of absolute logic, mathematical certainty, and cold, calculated justice. I hunted down untouchable criminals and dismantled global syndicates by remaining completely detached from human emotion. But watching the woman I loved actively dying behind a pane of glass stripped away every ounce of my professional armor. Evelyn was not just my wife. She was my anchor, the grace that balanced my cold, analytical nature. When I spent months tracking cartel money submerged in the darkest corners of human greed, she was the light that brought me back to the surface. She built the warmth of our home while I built the financial fortress around it. The doctor shouted the command again. The defibrillator discharged a second time. Her body slammed back onto the bed. Still nothing. I pressed my hands against the cold glass, a profound, crushing realization washing over me. Every single digital trap I had engineered, every piece of audio evidence I had meticulously collected, the offshore accounts, the wire fraud indictments, the entire brilliant machinery of my revenge was absolutely worthless if she did not survive. If Evelyn died on that table, Aaron and Megan and the Graham family would not just be criminals going to federal prison. They would be the people who successfully murdered my soul. I would just be a hollow, broken man sitting alone in an empty, silent house, clutching a pile of money and a handful of recorded confessions. I closed my eyes, silently begging a universe I rarely prayed to, offering every penny of my accumulated wealth just to hear the rhythmic beep of her heart monitor return. "Push another milligram of epinephrine," the lead physician commanded, his voice tight with desperation. "Charge to 300. Clear." The third electrical shock tore through her chest. The room hung in a terrifying, suspended silence for 3 agonizing seconds. Then a sharp, erratic spike jumped across the digital screen. It was followed by another, and another. The solid, deadly tone of the flat line broke into a weak, incredibly fast but steady rhythm. She was back. The medical team let out a collective, exhausted breath, rapidly adjusting her intravenous drips and securing a heavy oxygen mask over her face to stabilize her oxygen saturation levels. The lead doctor stepped out into the hallway, his scrubs dark with sweat. He looked at me, giving a slow, grim nod. "We stabilized her. Mr. Hayes," he stated, his voice incredibly quiet. "The severe toxicity from the synthetic beta blockers caused a massive cardiac arrest, but her heart is beating on its own again. She is incredibly strong." I walked into the room the moment the emergency team cleared out. I pulled a plastic chair directly against the metal railing of her bed and sat down. I did not leave that chair for 10 consecutive hours. I refused food, I refused water, and I ignored the vibrating alerts from my encrypted phone. I simply held her cold, fragile hand in mine, feeling the faint, steady pulse beneath her skin. I watched the sun slowly dip below the Chicago skyline, casting long, dark shadows across the Federal Medical Suite. The rhythmic, mechanical hiss of the ventilator and the steady beep of the heart monitor became my entire world. As the clock on the wall struck 8 in the evening, the deep, unnatural stillness of her medically induced coma began to shift. Her fingers resting weakly inside my own twitched. I leaned forward instantly, my breath catching in my throat. Evelyn's eyelids fluttered, struggling against the heavy weight of the sedatives. She let out a soft, pained groan, her head turning slightly against the crisp white pillow. I stood up gently, stroking her forehead, whispering her name softly to anchor her to the present reality. Evelyn's eyes slowly opened, glassy and unfocused at first, before finally locking onto my face. Recognition sparked in her deep brown eyes. She was fully conscious. Her breathing was shallow and labored. She weakly raised her free hand, her trembling fingers gripping the edge of the heavy plastic oxygen mask covering her mouth and nose. I tried to gently stop her, terrified she would disrupt her oxygen flow, but she pushed my hand away with a surprising, desperate surge of strength. She pulled the mask down just enough to expose her lips. I leaned in incredibly close, hovering just inches from her face. I fully expected her to confirm the audio recording I possessed, to tell me that our son Aaron was the one who poisoned her morning smoothie. I braced myself for the heartbreaking confirmation of a son's ultimate betrayal. Evelyn looked me dead in the eye, her gaze burning with an absolute terrifying clarity. Her voice was a raspy, painful whisper that sent a spike of pure ice straight through my veins. She named the person who physically pinned her down and forced the lethal synthetic pills down her throat. It was not Aaron. It was Graham. The name hung in the sterile hospital air, chilling me to my absolute core. Graham. Evelyn had not been poisoned by the cowardly, trembling hands of our son. The audio recording Megan had extorted me with, the one of Aaron crushing the pills into the morning smoothie, was only half the terrifying story. Aaron had prepared the poison, but he had clearly lacked the spine to actually administer the lethal dose to his own mother. Richard and Victoria Graham, the immaculate, wealthy socialites who looked down their noses at us in the intensive care unit waiting room, had physically entered my home, pinned my wife down, and violently forced the toxic dose down her throat. The sheer, terrifying implications of this revelation completely reshaped the entire battlefield in my mind. Aaron was not the mastermind of this assassination attempt. He was nothing more than a highly manipulated, desperate pawn on the Grahams' corporate chessboard. During my initial forensic tracing of Aaron's financial bleeding, I had focused entirely on his reckless crypto syndicate debts. I had logically assumed the Grahams were simply utilizing their expensive lawyers to protect their daughter from the severe legal fallout of his financial incompetence. But this physical, violent intervention meant their motivation went far deeper than simple parental protection. I stepped out of Evelyn's room, leaving her under the strict, watchful eyes of the armed federal guards, and pulled up my secure, encrypted terminal right there in the hospital corridor. I immediately ran a deep, unauthorized federal audit into Apex Holdings and the overarching Graham real estate empire. The numbers populating my screen illuminated a sprawling, catastrophic reality. The Grahams were not wealthy. They were phenomenally, terminally bankrupt. Their commercial properties were leveraged to the absolute limit, facing imminent, aggressive foreclosure from multiple international banking institutions. Their empire was a massive hollow shell game built entirely on toxic debt and fraudulent equity. They orchestrated Evelyn's murder because they desperately needed Aaron to inherit my 8-figure estate immediately. They fully intended to use my accumulated liquid wealth to completely bail out their sinking corporate empire, treating my family as nothing more than a sacrificial financial lifeline. I drove straight from the secure federal hospital to Jonathan Ellis' private office. It was 2 in the morning, but the former federal prosecutor was wide awake, meticulously reviewing the extortion audio files I had secured from Megan at the diner. I dropped the new, devastating truth onto his polished mahogany desk. The Grahams were the physical attackers, driven by absolute, impending corporate bankruptcy. Jonathan leaned back in his heavy leather chair, the cold, calculating gears of his legal mind turning rapidly. A standard police report would result in quiet arrests, closed-door preliminary hearings, and strict judicial gag orders. The Grahams would immediately liquidate the last of their hidden assets to hire elite defense attorneys who would drag the criminal proceedings out for years, intentionally shielding their reputation from the public eye. We could not possibly allow that to happen. We needed to annihilate them in broad daylight, stripping them of their stolen money, their freedom, and their meticulously crafted social standing, all at the exact same moment. During my 15 years auditing cartel money laundering fronts for the federal government, I learned a fundamental rule of engagement. Destroying a heavily fortified criminal enterprise requires luring the leadership completely out of their secure bunkers. You do not attack them where their legal defenses are strong. You offer them exactly what they want most in the world, wrapping a lethal, inescapable trap inside a package of undeniable greed. Jonathan and I spent the next 3 hours drafting a highly specific, legally binding document. It was not a civil lawsuit or a request for a protective restraining order. We drafted a formal, heavily documented letter of unconditional surrender. We proposed a private, immediate civil mediation to settle the entire estate dispute completely out of court. The language of the document was carefully engineered by Jonathan to directly stroke Richard Graham's massive, fragile ego. The text purposefully portrayed me as a broken, exhausted, terrified old man who had finally realized he was entirely outmatched by their superior legal and financial firepower. We officially submitted the mediation proposal via secure courier directly to the primary corporate legal team representing Apex Holdings, intentionally bypassing Aaron and Megan entirely to deal exclusively with the true puppet masters of this conspiracy. The terms outlined in the mediation proposal were shockingly, unbelievably generous, specifically designed to be absolutely irresistible to a bankrupt billionaire staring down the barrel of total corporate ruin. The letter explicitly stated that I was willing to sign a comprehensive, irrevocable transfer deed, relinquishing my entire multi-million-dollar estate, my liquid offshore assets, and all commercial property holdings directly to Aaron and Megan. I offered to completely withdraw my active opposition to the emergency guardianship filing, essentially handing the Grahams the keys to my kingdom, without requiring them to fight a protracted, expensive legal battle in the county probate court. I attached only one single non-negotiable condition to this massive financial surrender. The Grahams had to sign a binding federal non-interference agreement legally guaranteeing they would immediately cease all contact with Evelyn, withdraw their forged medical proxy forever, and leave my wife entirely alone for the remainder of her natural life. It was presented as the ultimate desperate plea of a thoroughly defeated husband who was willing to trade every single penny he had ever earned just to buy his wife's physical safety. To a normal, empathetic human being, such an immediate and total surrender would invite serious pause, or at least a healthy measure of caution. But to a cornered, arrogant narcissist currently drowning in hundreds of millions of dollars of toxic corporate debt, it looked exactly like total, unadulterated victory. I was handing them the exact massive financial bailout they desperately needed to save their fraudulent real estate empire, served on a polished silver platter. We did not have to wait long for their response. By 8 o'clock that same morning, Jonathan's secure terminal received an expedited, digitally signed confirmation directly from Richard Graham's lead corporate counsel. The Grahams were completely blinded by their own staggering arrogance and their desperate, suffocating greed. They truly believed they had successfully crushed me into total submission through their legal intimidation tactics at the hospital. They enthusiastically accepted the terms of the civil mediation without requesting a single alteration to the document. They demanded the official signing ceremony take place at noon the very next day, hosted entirely on their own territory, inside the main executive boardroom at the Apex Holdings corporate headquarters. The trap was perfectly set, the bait was taken, and they were actively marching toward their own absolute destruction. The elevator ascended rapidly to the top floor of the Apex Holdings corporate tower, a towering glass and steel monument to Richard Graham's entirely fraudulent empire. Jonathan Ellis walked beside me in absolute silence, his briefcase clutched firmly in his right hand. We were escorted by private security into a sprawling, opulent executive boardroom. The room was specifically designed to intimidate and overwhelm, featuring panoramic, unobstructed views of the Chicago skyline and an excessively large mahogany conference table that dominated the center of the floor. Sitting on the opposite side of that polished wood were the ruthless architects of my wife's attempted murder. Aaron and Megan sat remarkably close together, their posture radiating an arrogant, triumphant relief. Aaron adjusted the cuffs of his expensive silk suit, clearly believing the terrifying nightmare of his massive crypto syndicate debt was officially over. Megan offered a thin, venomous smirk, entirely confident that her cyber extortion tactics and stolen documents had successfully broken my will to fight. Flanking the younger couple were Richard and Victoria Graham. Victoria sat with perfect rigid posture, her hands folded neatly on the pristine table as if she were attending a high society charity gala, rather than finalizing the hostile, violent takeover of a man's entire life savings. Richard Graham leaned back in his plush leather executive chair, looking at me with the absolute disdain of a medieval conqueror surveying a ruined, burning landscape. He did not bother to hide his intense gloating. He truly believed he had flawlessly executed a masterstroke of corporate and familial manipulation, using my foolish son as a highly convenient pawn to secure the exact financial bailout he desperately needed to save his crumbling legacy. There were no corporate lawyers present in the room today. Richard clearly wanted this to be a private, deeply humiliating surrender, ensuring no outside legal counsel could witness the sheer brutality of his extortion firsthand. The air in the room was suffocatingly thick with their collective arrogance. Richard Graham did not waste a single second with pleasantries or fake manufactured sympathy. He leaned aggressively forward, retrieved a thick, heavily bound legal document from his embossed leather portfolio, and slid it forcefully across the smooth mahogany surface. The heavy document came to a halt directly in front of me, accompanied by a sleek, incredibly expensive gold fountain pen. "Sign it, Lawrence." Richard commanded, his voice dripping with condescension and absolute certainty. "You lost. You played a decent game with your little banking lockouts, but you were always entirely out of your depth. Sign the transfer deed, relinquish the estate, and we will take care of Aaron now." He gestured dismissively toward my son, treating him like an acquired asset rather than a human being. Aaron refused to meet my gaze, keeping his eyes firmly locked on the transfer document that represented his sole financial salvation from the Eastern European debt collectors. I stared at the contract, a physical manifestation of their boundless, unchecked greed. During my 15 years auditing cartel money laundering fronts and dismantling massive corporate tax evasions, I learned a highly specific truth about the ultra-wealthy. The most dangerous criminals do not wear ski masks or operate in dark, abandoned alleyways. The most lethal predators wear bespoke Italian suits, operate out of penthouse boardrooms, and deeply believe their accumulated wealth grants them total, unquestionable immunity from any legal consequence. Richard Graham was a man entirely accustomed to crushing innocent people with impunity. He built his entire real estate empire by cannibalizing vulnerable businesses, heavily leveraging toxic, unpayable debt, and aggressively intimidating anyone who dared to audit his fraudulent, manipulated ledgers. He assumed my 30 years of federal service had simply made me a tired, compliant bureaucrat easily bullied by threats of prolonged litigation and exhausting probate court battles. He thought I was eagerly signing away my life savings out of a desperate, pathetic need to protect my wife from further physical harm. He did not realize that I had spent the last 48 hours completely mapping the terminal, irreversible decay of his corporate empire. He did not know I possessed the forensic proof of his impending bankruptcy, the undeniable digital evidence of his daughter's felony extortion, and the chilling first-hand testimony of his attempted murder victim. I looked at the heavy gold pen resting cleanly on top of the surrender document. I did not reach for the pen. I did not even look at the fraudulent contract again. The heavy silence in the sprawling boardroom stretched into a tense, suffocating vacuum as my total refusal to immediately comply registered on their smug faces. Richard's victorious expression faltered, a slight deep crease of irritation forming on his forehead. Jonathan Ellis stood perfectly still beside me, a silent, imposing sentinel witnessing the exact moment the tide of the war permanently shifted. I calmly unlatched the heavy brass locks of my fireproof briefcase. The metallic clicks echoed sharply in the quiet room. I reached inside and retrieved a thick black dossier bound tightly with heavy-duty federal evidence clasps. This was not a simple file folder or a standard legal brief. It was a comprehensive, meticulously documented weapon containing every single piece of evidence I had gathered since I rushed home from my canceled fishing trip. I placed my hand flat on top of the black dossier and pushed it firmly across the expansive mahogany table. It slid with a heavy, ominous thud, coming to rest exactly on top of Richard's transfer deed, completely covering the gold pen. Aaron's eyes darted nervously between the black folder and my stoic face, his breathing hitching slightly. Megan shifted uncomfortably in her leather chair, the first genuine flicker of doubt breaking through her previously impenetrable, arrogant facade. Victoria Graham let out a sharp, highly indignant sigh, completely offended by my blatant insubordination and refusal to surrender. "What kind of pathetic stunt are you trying to pull here, Lawrence?" Richard demanded, his voice rising in sudden anger as he glared at the black folder covering his victory contract. "You are in absolutely no position to negotiate terms or play games. You sign the paper right now, or we walk out of this room and finalize the emergency guardianship petition by the end of the day." I kept my hands resting calmly on the cold edge of the mahogany table. I did not raise my voice, but I allowed the full, terrifying weight of my 30 years of federal auditing experience to resonate in my unwavering tone. I stared directly into Richard Graham's eyes, watching the arrogant billionaire slowly realize he had walked blindly into an inescapable, lethal trap. "I did not come here to sign anything," I stated, my voice echoing coldly and definitively through the expansive, silent boardroom. "I came to annihilate you." The tension in the boardroom was so thick it felt like physical pressure. Richard Graham scoffed at my statement, dismissing my words as the pathetic bluster of a broken man. I did not waste my breath repeating myself. I reached into my jacket pocket, retrieved my smartphone, and placed it flat on the mahogany table right next to the black dossier. I tapped the screen once. The crystal-clear audio file I had recorded at the diner began to play at maximum volume, echoing sharply off the glass walls of the corporate suite. Megan's voice filled the room, cold and utterly ruthless. "Aaron is a sinking ship, and I absolutely refuse to drown with him. I will transfer the original, unedited audio file directly to your secure server right now. It is everything you need to lock your son in a federal penitentiary for the rest of his natural life. In exchange, you are going to wire $100,000 into a secure, untraceable account I have set up in Zurich." The recording captured every single syllable of her felony extortion, followed immediately by the damning background audio of Aaron crushing the synthetic beta blockers into the blender. The color drained entirely from Aaron's face. He sat frozen, staring at his wife as the reality of her profound betrayal crashed into his desperate mind. He had risked federal prison, horrific syndicate debt, and the murder of his own mother, all under the delusion that he and Megan were a unified team. He suddenly realized she had been plotting to throw him to the wolves the very second his financial utility expired. A primal, guttural roar ripped from Aaron's throat. The last shred of his polished broker facade shattered completely. He lunged across the wide table, completely disregarding the expensive crystal water glasses shattering onto the floor. His hands shot forward like vices, wrapping violently around Megan's throat. Her smug arrogance instantly transformed into pure, choking terror as she crashed backward in her heavy leather chair, flailing wildly and clawing at his wrists. Aaron drove her into the floor, his face twisted in absolute unhinged rage. Victoria Graham screamed in horror, scrambling out of her seat to pull my son off her gasping daughter. Richard shouted useless commands, the pristine dignity of his executive boardroom descending into brutal, animalistic chaos. Jonathan and I did not flinch. We did not intervene to break up the violent domestic dispute. I reached forward, unclasped the black dossier, and forcefully spread the heavy stack of federal indictments and banking records across the table, ensuring they perfectly covered the fraudulent transfer deed Richard had attempted to force upon me. "While your daughter and my son tear each other apart for the scraps of their failed conspiracy, let us discuss your impending ruin," Richard, I stated, raising my voice just enough to cut through the sounds of struggling and choking on the floor. During my decades auditing illicit financial fronts for the federal government, I learned that corporate predators like you only attack when they are bleeding internally. You did not orchestrate the poisoning of my wife simply to protect your daughter from my son's crypto syndicate debts. You held Evelyn down and forced those pills down her throat because Apex Holdings is currently defaulting on $300 million of highly leveraged commercial real estate loans. I pushed the highlighted foreclosure notices toward him. You are completely bankrupt. Your entire empire is a mountain of toxic debt, and you desperately needed Aaron to inherit my 8-figure estate to provide an immediate liquidity injection. You thought my family was a convenient salvage yard to bail out your fraudulent legacy. I then slid the red stamped transaction logs from my secure terminal next to his foreclosure papers. That is why you fast-tracked the medical proxy to execute my wife today. But you are too late. I set a digital trap last night. Your brilliant daughter and my foolish son took the bait. Moving fictitious funds across state lines to a Cayman Islands routing address, using stolen credentials. They committed textbook federal wire fraud, and the transaction was automatically flagged to the Treasury Department the moment it initiated. Richard Graham stared at the financial documents spread across his conference table. The arrogant, untouchable billionaire was evaporating right before my eyes. The deep tan of his skin gave way to a sickly mottled purple as a terrifying cocktail of fury and absolute panic flooded his veins. He looked down at the floor where Aaron was still grappling with Megan, completely ignoring his daughter's desperate, gasping pleas for help. His meticulously constructed world of corporate immunity, expensive lawyers, and inherited privilege was crumbling into dust. He realized he was not just facing financial ruin. He was looking at a life sentence for conspiracy to commit murder backed by a mountain of undeniable digital and forensic evidence that I had systematically curated. The sheer magnitude of his defeat broke something deep inside his narcissistic mind. The realization that an older, retired black auditor had effortlessly outmaneuvered his entire corporate legal team and dismantled his family drove him into a blind, vicious rage. "I will destroy you for this!" Richard spat, his voice trembling with a terrifying, venomous hatred. "You think you can just walk into my building, throw some fabricated banking logs on my desk, and threaten me? I own this city. I own the judges. You are nothing but a delusional, pathetic old man who just handed me the very documents I need to bury you." He slammed his hand onto the table, leaning forward aggressively. He reached frantically for the heavy multi-line intercom phone sitting on the edge of his desk. He intended to summon his private security force to physically assault us, seize the evidence dossier, and throw Jonathan and me out into the street to be arrested for trespassing. "Security, get up here immediately and lock down this entire floor," he screamed, his finger hovering frantically over the emergency dial button. He thought his money could build a wall thick enough to keep the consequences out. Before Richard could press the glowing red button to summon his private guards, a deafening crash echoed through the executive suite. The heavy reinforced oak doors of the boardroom were violently kicked open, the heavy brass hinges splintering against the frame. A tactical team of heavily armed federal agents wearing dark tactical vests flooded into the room. They moved with terrifying coordinated precision, their weapons raised and their commands sharp and absolute. "Federal agents, nobody move," the lead officer roared, cutting through the chaos on the floor and freezing Richard Graham in his tracks. But the armed federal agents were not the true terror marching into that room. They parted down the middle, making way for the final devastating piece of my retribution. The federal agents flooded the boardroom with overwhelming kinetic force. Their heavy tactical boots trampled over the shattered crystal on the floor, instantly transforming the apex of corporate luxury into a federally secured crime scene. Two heavily armored agents grabbed Aaron by the shoulders, ripping him away from Megan's throat and slamming his face hard against the polished mahogany table. Another agent pinned Megan to the carpet, securing her wrists in heavy zip ties while she sobbed hysterically and pleaded for someone to help her. Richard Graham dropped the intercom phone as if it had suddenly caught fire, his hands trembling violently in the air. He immediately tried to deploy his usual weapon, which was his immense wealth. He began screaming about his high-priced lawyers demanding badge numbers and threatening to sue the entire federal government for illegal trespassing and corporate harassment. The lead FBI agent did not even blink at the empty threats. He unrolled a thick stack of federal warrants authorized by a federal judge just 30 minutes prior, loudly declaring the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, federal wire fraud, and massive corporate racketeering. Victoria Graham collapsed into her leather chair, clutching her chest as the absolute reality of their destruction set in. The corporate litigators who were supposed to protect them were nowhere to be found, having likely abandoned the building the second they saw the tactical team swarming the lobby. But the badges, the weapons, and the loud reading of the federal indictments were not the true source of terror for the people in that room. The ultimate punishment was not going to be delivered by the United States Justice Department. It was going to be delivered by the woman they tried to put in the ground. The tactical team suddenly stepped back, parting down the center aisle of the boardroom to clear a wide path from the shattered oak doors. Behind the armored wall of federal agents, a specialized medical nurse slowly wheeled a heavy medical transport chair into the center of the executive suite. Sitting upright in that chair was my beautiful wife. Evelyn looked incredibly frail, her skin pale against the dark hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and a clear oxygen cannula rested beneath her nose. But her posture was rigid with an unbreakable dignity, and her dark brown eyes burned with a fierce, terrifying clarity. This was the woman who had spent 40 years teaching underprivileged children how to stand up for themselves, a woman who possessed an internal moral compass forged in iron. The Grahams thought they were dealing with a weak, disposable senior citizen who would simply fade away without a fight. They drastically underestimated the absolute resilience of a woman who had spent her entire life surviving in a world designed to keep her down. When she flatlined in the intensive care unit, her heart did not stop because it was weak. It stopped because it was violently overloaded by their synthetic poison. The moment she woke up from that medically induced coma, she did not cry or ask for pity. She demanded justice. The heavy silence in the boardroom was absolute. Aaron, pinned against the table, slowly turned his head to look at the doorway. When his eyes locked onto his mother, a guttural, wretched sound escaped his throat. It was the sound of a coward realizing that his ultimate sin had just been resurrected from the grave. Megan stopped sobbing, staring at Evelyn as if she were looking at a literal ghost. Richard Graham staggered backward, hitting the edge of the window frame, the arrogant billionaire completely stripped of his power. Evelyn did not look at our son first. She ignored the pathetic, sobbing mess he had become. Her burning gaze locked directly onto Richard and Victoria Graham. She raised her trembling right arm, her index finger pointing like a loaded weapon straight at the billionaire and his daughter. She did not whisper. She spoke with a clear, steady voice that echoed off the glass walls, shattering the last remaining illusions in the room. "They are the ones who did it," Evelyn declared, her voice carrying the undeniable weight of absolute truth. She pointed directly at Richard Graham and Megan. He pinned my arms down to the kitchen floor while she forced those bitter capsules down my throat. They told me I had lived long enough and that it was time to move out of their way. The entire boardroom erupted in shock. The federal agents immediately seized Richard Graham, slamming him aggressively against the glass window of his own corporate tower and locking heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. Victoria shrieked as a female agent secured her arms firmly behind her back, reading her the Miranda rights. But the most devastating reaction came from Aaron. Hearing the explicit physical details of how his wealthy in-laws had violently assaulted his mother completely broke his fragile delusional reality. He finally realized he was not the mastermind of a bloodless financial transition. He was the pathetic, manipulated pawn who had actively enabled the brutal torture of the woman who gave him life. Aaron dropped to his knees, disregarding the agents holding him, and began to wail. He begged Evelyn for forgiveness, sobbing uncontrollably onto the expensive carpet, screaming that he did not know they were going to hurt her like that. Evelyn looked down at her only child with an expression of profound, chilling indifference. "You knew exactly what they were going to do, Aaron," she said coldly. "You traded my life to pay your debts. You are no longer my son." The federal agents hauled Aaron up by his collar, dragging him toward the door alongside his weeping wife and her bankrupt, murderous parents. The parade of traitors was marched out of the executive suite, permanently stripped of their dignity, their wealth, and their freedom. I stood silently beside my wife, my hand resting firmly on her shoulder, as I watched the elevator doors close on them for the last time. Within a month, I liquidated every single property, every stock portfolio, and every piece of the estate they had so desperately tried to steal. I transferred the massive wealth into impenetrable offshore trusts meant entirely for our own enjoyment, completely out of the reach of any future probate court. 6 months later, Evelyn and I sat on the private balcony of a luxury cruise ship sailing across the crystal blue waters of the Mediterranean. We watched the golden sun dip below the horizon, holding hands in perfect, undisturbed peace. There was no reconciliation. There were no prison visits. We delivered absolute severance with zero forgiveness, and we never looked back. Looking back at the shattered remains of what used to be our family, the most profound lesson I learned was not about the depravity of greedy in-laws or the terrifying effectiveness of digital security traps. The truest and most painful lesson is about the lethal danger of unconditional financial enablement. For decades, Evelyn and I believed that providing our son with endless resources, bailing him out of minor debts, and shielding him from the harsh consequences of his own reckless decisions was the ultimate expression of parental love. We thought we were building a safety net that would allow him to thrive. In reality, we were slowly constructing the very weapon he would eventually turn against us. When you constantly cushion someone from the impact of their own failures, you do not teach them gratitude. You teach them massive, unchecked entitlement. Aaron did not grow up to respect the 30 years of grueling federal audits and quiet sacrifices that built our multi-million-dollar estate. Because he never had to sweat for a single dollar of it, he viewed our accumulated wealth not as a testament to our hard work, but as his inevitable right. That entitlement rotted his moral compass. It made him susceptible to the toxic influence of the Graham family, who taught him that people are merely stepping stones to greater financial liquidity. If we had established rigid financial boundaries early on, if we had allowed him to fall and face the brutal reality of his own actions, he might have developed the spine required to stand up to his corrupt wife and her murderous parents. Setting absolute financial boundaries with your loved ones is never an act of cruelty. It is the most fundamental act of mutual survival. Without these strict limits in place, greed will inevitably fester and destroy everything you hold dear. You worked incredibly hard for every single thing you own, sacrificing your youth and energy to build stability. You must force the people in your life to earn their own way to respect the value of a dollar and to understand that your resources are a privilege, never a right. The moment someone begins to look at your bank account as their personal emergency fund, the dynamic of the relationship fundamentally shifts from love to exploitation. You stop being a parent, a spouse, or a friend, and you become nothing more than a living, breathing, automated teller machine. And as we learned in the most horrifying way possible, when an automated teller machine stops dispensing cash, the people who rely on it will try to dismantle it by any means necessary. Do not wait until you are lying in a hospital bed to discover who truly loves you and who is simply waiting for you to die. Protect your assets with the same ferocity that you protect your physical safety. Test the loyalties of the people around you by simply saying no to their financial demands. The ones who stay are your true family. The ones who leave, or the ones who lash out in anger, were only ever there for the payout. You owe your wealth to absolutely no one but yourself. If this story resonated with you, or if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace and sanity, let me know in the comments section below. Share your experiences, hit the like button to support the channel, and subscribe for more stories of justice and survival. Thank you for listening, and remember to always guard your heart and your wealth.